Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutally hot, sand-covered life of the people who quite literally built ancient Egypt, the slaves. You've probably seen them in movies, walking in perfectly choreographed lines while dramatic music swells and some Hollywood actor playing a pharaoh points dramatically at the horizon. But trust me, being a real Egyptian slave was nothing like a cinematic montage with inspirational music. It was dirty, exhausting, soul-crushing work. And in every case, it absolutely sucked. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You were born into bondage, breathing your first under someone else's roof. No choices, no rights, no fancy titles, just the mark of ownership, callus-shaped blisters, and the scent of sweat baked into your baby blanket. From the moment you can walk without tripping into the water bucket, you're expected to serve. By age 6, you're officially a slave's helper, which is a polite Egyptian way of saying tiny unpaid servant with zero rights and permanent fear etched on your face. Your toys, broken pottery shards, your playground, a dirt courtyard next to a house you'll never own. While other Egyptian children are playing Senate games and learning to write, you're learning how not to die from dehydration under the desert sun. Fun games include, don't look the overseer in the eye, carry this until your arms break, and try not to cry when the master's son kicks you again. Your mother, another slave, is a tired, hollow-eyed woman whose entire vocabulary consists of whispers, warnings, and the phrase, head down, keep working. She's got hands like cracked leather and a permanent hunch from decades of grinding grain and carrying water jars. She teaches you everything: how to move silently, how to anticipate orders, how to become invisible when visitors arrive. You don't ask questions. You just observe, absorb, and obey. Mostly because asking questions results in a flying sandal and extra work grinding flour until midnight. Freedom! Nice idea. You don't get that. The master's household doesn't take breaks, and neither do you. Someone always needs something fetched, cleaned, or carried. You learn quickly that sleep is just the brief darkness between one order and the next. And while you're technically a living being, what you're really learning is pain tolerance, heat endurance, and how to fall asleep standing up. By the time you're 10, you already smell like dust, speak only when spoken to, and have learned to carry water jars that weigh more than your entire body. Your master's cat gets better food than you do, assuming it didn't run away from the abuse 2 years ago. This is your life now. Welcome to ancient Egyptian slavery. Hope you like hunger, fear, and 7 decades of bone-crushing labor. If you thought pyramid building was the worst job, think again. That was just one flavor of the misery menu. For every colossal monument that tourists photograph today, thousands of nameless slaves lived and died in conditions that would make modern prison look like a luxury resort. But at least prison sentences end. Your sentence? Lifetime with no possibility of parole. The majestic Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, flowed past you every day. But you weren't allowed to appreciate its beauty. To you, it was just another workplace hazard: crocodiles, disease, and the constant risk of drowning while washing your master's linens. The same river that blessed Egypt with fertility cursed you with endless irrigation work, digging channels under the merciless sun until your hands bled and your back gave out. Behind every golden treasure, every painted tomb, every hieroglyphic boasting of Egypt's greatness, there stood an army of the invisible. People whose names were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged, whose bodies were tossed aside when they finally collapsed. Not even worthy of proper burial, just another used-up tool to be discarded. And here's the most disturbing part. When archaeologists uncover these magnificent treasures today, they're actually touching the fingerprints of the forgotten. Every stone block, every grain of mortar, every painted wall carries the invisible handprint of someone who had no choice but to build monuments to the very people who owned their bodies and crushed their spirits. So tonight, as we explore the brutal reality of Egyptian slavery, remember this: the true wonder isn't that these magnificent structures were built. The true wonder is that any slave found the will to survive another day in a world designed to work them to death. Because in the shadow of the pyramids, under the blazing Egyptian sun, the greatest miracle wasn't the architecture, it was the human spirit that somehow endured despite having every reason to break. The sun rises over the Nile, bathing the world in golden light. Birds soar above the papyrus reeds, and somewhere in the distance, a nobleman's barge glides serenely across the water. But you don't see any of this beauty. Your first light of day filters through cracks in a mud brick wall of a slave quarter where your mother just delivered you onto a straw mat stained with the fluids of your birth. You were born into bondage, your first breath drawn in the shadow of someone else's house. No celebration announces your arrival, no gifts await, no priest comes to bless your name. You're simply another piece of property added to your master's inventory, like a new pot or an extra linen sheet. The midwife, another slave, simply checks that you have all your limbs, not out of concern for your well-being, but to assess your future work value. Your mother cradles you briefly. Her hands are calloused, her fingers permanently bent from years of grinding grain. Tomorrow she returns to work. Tonight is all she gets. She whispers your name, the only thing she can truly give you that belongs to you alone. But even this small mercy will be overridden when your master decides to call you whatever he pleases. Names are for people. You are property. The pathways to slavery in ancient Egypt were numerous, but you've traveled the most common one: inheritance. Your mother was a slave, therefore you are a slave. Simple mathematical inheritance, as inevitable as the flooding of the Nile. Your mother herself may have been born this way, or perhaps she was captured in one of Egypt's military campaigns in Nubia or Canaan. Entire villages disappeared into Egypt's appetite for unpaid labor. Men, women, children, all converted into walking tools with beating hearts. Some came through debt slavery, a particularly cruel Egyptian innovation. A bad harvest, a sick child needing medicine, an unexpected tax. Any of these could force a desperate farmer to offer himself as collateral for a loan. When he couldn't repay, his freedom became the payment. Sometimes entire families entered bondage this way, including children not yet born. Imagine having your future sold before you even existed. Welcome to Egypt, where your debt follows you into the next generation. Criminal punishment created another pathway. Steal a loaf of bread? 10 years as a slave in the mines. Speak disrespectfully to a noble? Your entire family might end up serving his household. The scales of Egyptian justice weren't just unbalanced, they were deliberately designed to convert the vulnerable into the owned. By the time you're 3, you've already absorbed the fundamental truth of your existence. You learn it not through words, but through observation. You see how your mother flinches when the master enters the room. You notice how she lowers her eyes, how her voice changes. You absorb the difference between the master's children and yourself, their clean linen clothes versus your rough scrap of fabric, their sandaled feet versus your bare ones. Your earliest toys? Not carved wooden animals or painted dolls. You play with broken pottery shards, discarded reeds, or stones picked up from the courtyard. Your games are interrupted whenever someone needs something fetched. You, slave child, bring water. And just like that, playtime ends. Not that it matters. You're already being trained to find joy in serving. Good slaves are happy slaves, the overseer reminds everyone. It's your first lesson in the elaborate lie designed to make your exploitation feel natural. By age 5, you're following your mother through her daily tasks, learning by watching. No formal education for you. No reading hieroglyphs or calculating numbers. Your education is purely practical. How to grind grain without getting too much stone dust in it. How to carry water without spilling a drop. How to become invisible when guests arrive. You learn that eye contact with free Egyptians is dangerous. You discover which overseers might slip you an extra crust of bread and which ones enjoy using their whips. Your mother teaches you to survive through whispered lessons at night. Always look busy, even when there's nothing to do. Never appear smarter than you are. If the master is angry, make yourself small. These aren't just suggestions, they're survival strategies passed down through generations of the enslaved. Your bedtime stories aren't tales of gods and heroes, but warnings disguised as fables. The clever slave who tried to escape and ended up working in the mines. The beautiful slave girl who caught the master's eye and was never seen again. The worst part isn't the work or the hunger or even the occasional beating. It's watching other children play freely while you cannot join them. From the shadow of the kitchen, you observe the master's children learning to write on papyrus, playing with wooden toys, being taught to swim in the garden pool. The social divide is painfully clear even to your young mind. They are becoming people. You are becoming property. By age 7, you've been separated from your mother for work assignments. Perhaps you're sent to tend the master's garden, to fan flies from the mistress's face, or to help in the hot, smoky kitchen. Your small size makes you perfect for cleaning narrow spaces or running messages between household staff. Your hands are already developing calluses. Your back already knows the ache of long hours. Your childhood isn't just shortened, it's functionally non-existent. Sleep brings no real escape. Your dreams are haunted by tasks undone and punishments feared. You share sleeping quarters with other slaves, a corner of the kitchen, a spot in the storage room, or if you're particularly unlucky, just a patch of ground in the courtyard. Privacy doesn't exist. Your body doesn't belong to you, so why would your space? The master's children learn to see through you as if you're made of air. Sometimes they're cruel, tripping you as you carry water, blaming you for their own mischief, using you as the target in their games. Other times they simply act as if you're a walking tool, no more worthy of acknowledgement than a broom or a cooking pot. Which hurts more? The active cruelty or the casual erasure of your humanity? Both leave scars, just different kinds. Food comes in the form of basics. Coarse bread that cracks your gums, onions, occasional beer that's mostly sediment, and if you're lucky, some dried fish too old for the master's table. The portions are calculated with mathematical precision, just enough to keep you working, not enough to give you energy for resistance. Your hunger becomes a constant companion, so familiar you stop noticing it, except in its brief absence after meals. Sometimes new slaves arrive. You watch wide-eyed as they're brought in chains, captured foreigners from Pharaoh's latest military campaign. They speak strange languages, wear strange clothes, and their eyes hold a wild desperation you've never seen. They fight at first, resist, try to maintain their former identities. The overseers break them systematically, through beatings, through starvation, through isolation. Within months, their eyes carry the same dull acceptance you see in every slave. Their foreign gods didn't save them. Egypt's gods don't care about them. This is the theology of slavery, divine indifference packaged as cosmic order. You learn early that slave families exist at the master's convenience. Your father might work in the fields, but you'll see him rarely, if at all. Brothers and sisters can be sold to different households on a master's whim. The worst stories, whispered after dark, tell of masters who breed slaves like cattle, selecting partners based on strength or skills, hoping for offspring that combine desired traits. Your body, your bloodline, your reproductive capability, none of it belongs to you. Religious festivals bring extra work rather than celebration. While free Egyptians honor Osiris or Isis with feasts and processions, you're busy preparing food, cleaning spaces, and ensuring the celebrations run smoothly. You might catch glimpses of sacred rituals, but never as a participant, always as the backdrop, the human machinery that enables others' spiritual connections while being denied your own. By age 10, you understand the full meaning of your existence in Egyptian society. The hieroglyph for slave tells the story. A bound captive, a person restrained. In art, slaves are depicted smaller than free people. a visual reinforcement of your diminished status. When scribes keep household inventories, you're listed alongside livestock and furniture. Your value is calculated in practical terms: how many years of work you might provide, what skills you possess, what you would fetch if sold at market. You learn to disappear into your function. When carrying water, you become just a water carrier. When sweeping, just a sweeper. This psychological vanishing act is both survival tactic and profound loss. To be truly seen would be dangerous, but to never be seen is its own kind of death, the erasure of self while the body continues serving. The cruelest trick of your bondage is how Egypt's institutions normalize it. Priests explain that the gods created order, with each person in their proper place. Your place happens to be at the bottom, but it's still divinely ordained, or so they claim. Laws protect slaves only as property rights of their owners. Even the kindest master sees you as an investment to be maintained, not a person to be respected. The entire weight of Egyptian civilization, its religion, its law, its social customs, presses down to hold you in place. And so your childhood, if it can even be called that, shapes you not for possibility, but for service. You don't dream of becoming a scribe or a priestess or a trader. You don't dream at all. You simply learn to endure, to survive, to make yourself useful enough to avoid the worst punishments. By the time you reach adolescence, the yoke of slavery fits so perfectly you barely feel its weight anymore. That's the true horror of being born enslaved. Not just the physical conditions, but how thoroughly the system colonizes your mind until bondage feels like the natural order of things. Your life has just begun, but your fate was sealed the moment you drew your first breath in the shadow of your master's house. Tomorrow brings more of the same, and the day after, and every day until your body gives out or, in the rarest of circumstances, someone decides to set you free. But don't count on that last part. In ancient Egypt, the gods themselves wore golden collars. What hope does a slave have for breaking their chains? Morning doesn't arrive gently for you. There's no slow awakening, no peaceful transition from dreams to reality. Instead, dawn breaks with a kick to your ribs or a sharp command. Up, now. The overseer doesn't care that you've slept only 4 hours on a reed mat so thin you can count the pebbles beneath it with your spine. The sun isn't fully above the horizon, but your day has already begun. Your first task: emptying the master's chamber pots. Nothing says good morning, quite like carrying someone else's waste through the pre-dawn darkness. Your stomach growls. It's been hours since your last meager meal. But breakfast isn't your priority. The master's breakfast is. You must help prepare it, serve it, and clean up after it, before you'll get your own pitiful ration. By the time the noble Egyptian households are enjoying their morning meal of bread, fruit, and perhaps some fowl, you've already been working for 2 hours. Your reward? A fist-sized portion of coarse bread, so dense and gritty with chaff that it feels like eating sandstone. Maybe an onion if you're lucky. The bread is often slightly moldy, not enough to kill you, just enough to add a bitter note to its already unpleasant flavor. This isn't food meant for enjoyment. It's fuel, calculated with precision. The minimum required to keep your body functioning without wasting resources on a mere slave. Water comes from the same Nile that receives the city's waste. Sometimes it's drawn directly, bringing whatever parasites and bacteria flourish in Egypt's sacred river. Other times, it's from cisterns, where it's sat stagnating for days. Either way, your body has adapted, mostly. The occasional stomach illness is just another feature of your existence, like the calluses on your feet or the permanent crick in your neck. Your daily tasks vary depending on where you've been assigned. Household slaves might sweep floors with palm fiber brushes, wash linens in the river while avoiding crocodiles, prepare food in sweltering kitchens, or tend to the endless mending of garments. Field slaves work under the merciless Egyptian sun, backs bent in irrigation channels or over crops, moving in rhythm to the overseer's count. Construction slaves haul stones, mix mortar, or shape mud bricks, their bodies becoming as weathered as the monuments they build. The heat is your constant companion. Egypt's climate doesn't care about your comfort. By midday, the temperature bakes the very air you breathe. Sweat pours from your body, instantly evaporating in the dry heat or creating salty rivulets through the dust caked on your skin. Water breaks are scheduled with mathematical precision, just enough to prevent collapse, not enough to provide relief. Your thirst becomes a living thing, clawing at your throat from the inside. There's no respite from the sun if you work outdoors, no shade breaks, no cooling dips in the river. Your skin darkens, not with the fashionable tan of a vacationer, but with the leathery hardness of constant exposure. Blisters form, burst, callus over, and form again in an endless cycle. Your eyes squint permanently against the glare, creating a network of premature wrinkles by your 20th year. Slaves age in dog years, each season weathering your body like 7. Midday brings a brief pause, not out of kindness but practical necessity. Even Egyptian slave owners recognized that the hottest hours might actually kill their human property, diminishing their investment. You're granted a short rest, though rest is a generous term for collapsing in whatever patch of shade you can find, too exhausted to even swat away the flies that land on your face. Lunch, if it can be called that, consists of more bread, perhaps some boiled vegetables too tough or bitter for the master's table. Occasionally there's dried fish, its smell powerful enough to make your eyes water, but still better than nothing. You eat quickly, knowing each moment of rest is precious. Some slaves fall asleep mid-bite, their bodies demanding the recovery their masters won't allow. Then it's back to work until sunset. The afternoon hours stretch like eternity, muscles screaming, joints aching, hands cracked and bleeding. Every task seems designed to push human endurance to its limit. Moving irrigation water requires standing waist-deep in mud and refuse for hours. Building requires hauling loads that would strain a donkey. Household work means constant movement, constant vigilance, constant fear of making a mistake that might earn punishment. You develop a survival rhythm. Your mind detaches from your body, floating somewhere above the pain and exhaustion. Your movements become mechanical, practiced through endless repetition. Your thoughts drift to simple pleasures, the slightly cooler breeze that sometimes comes at dusk, the extra crust of bread you manage to hide for later, the brief moment when you might exchange a glance with another slave, a tiny acknowledgement that you're both still human despite everything. The living quarters where you collapse at night barely deserve the name. For field slaves, it might be a crude barracks, low mud brick structures with minimal ventilation, packed with bodies. Construction slaves often sleep at the worksite in temporary shelters that offer little protection from cold desert nights or blowing sand. Household slaves might claim a corner of the kitchen, a storage room, or even just a hallway where they unroll their thin sleeping mats. These quarters are breeding grounds for disease and vermin. Lice make their home in your hair, fleas feast on your blood, rats scurry across your sleeping form. The smell is a complex bouquet of unwashed bodies, urine, smoke, and whatever food might be rotting nearby. Privacy doesn't exist. Not for bodily functions, not for sleep, not for tears. Even your dreams belong to the collective misery, playing out within earshot of a dozen other exhausted souls. Clothing, if you're fortunate enough to have any, consists of the simplest linen wraps, often repurposed from sacks or worn-out household textiles. Nothing fits properly. Nothing stays clean for long. Nothing belongs exclusively to you. Some slaves wear the same garment until it literally falls apart, held together by crude repairs and sheer determination. Your feet remain bare unless your work requires protection, not out of concern for you, but to preserve the functionality of the tool your body represents. Personal hygiene becomes an almost impossible challenge. The same water you use for cleaning is filled with waterborne illness. Soap, when available, is a luxury reserved for your masters. You make do with sand, scrubbing your skin raw to remove the accumulated grime of labor. Your hair, if not shaved for cleanliness, becomes a tangled mass, cut haphazardly with dull blades when it interferes with work. Your teeth begin to fail early, ground down by the grit in your food, weakened by nutritional deficiencies. Dental pain becomes another background note in the symphony of discomfort. that defines your existence. The loss of teeth isn't just a cosmetic issue. It's another small death, another piece of yourself falling away under the relentless pressure of servitude. Sleep should be your refuge, but even that is contaminated by your status. You don't rest, you collapse. Your dreams are haunted by the next day's labor, your muscles twitching with phantom movements even as you lie still. The overseer's voice follows you into unconsciousness, counting cadence, demanding more. 4 or 5 hours later, the cycle begins again with another rough awakening. Disease spreads quickly in slave quarters. One person's cough becomes everyone's pneumonia. Eye infections pass from hand to face to hand. Parasites find perfect breeding conditions in the crowded, unsanitary spaces where you sleep. Medical care, a bitter joke. Unless you're a particularly valuable slave, your illness will be addressed with either indifference or irritation at your reduced productivity. Recovery happens through your body's stubborn resilience or not at all. The seasons bring their own varieties of misery. Summer heat makes every task a battle against heat stroke. The inundation season means endless labor, reinforcing structures against flooding while standing in water and mud. Winter nights in the desert drop to freezing temperatures, and your thin coverings offer minimal protection. There's no comfortable season for a slave, just different flavors of endurance. Time blurs in this existence. Days bleed into one another, marked only by the movement of the sun and the changing of tasks. Weeks become indistinguishable. Years register only in your body's slow deterioration. You might measure time by overseers, that was during the fat one's tenure, or back when the one-eyed man held the whip. Your life doesn't follow the orderly calendar that guides Egyptian religious ceremonies and administrative functions. Your time belongs to others, parceled out in increments of labor. The psychological weight of this daily existence is perhaps heavier than the physical burden. Every moment reinforces your status as property rather than person. When the master's child spills water, it's cleaned up immediately. When you spill water, it's evidence of your carelessness, your inherent inferiority. The same action produces radically different responses depending on who performs it, a constant reminder of the fundamental inequality that structures your world. Conversation becomes another luxury denied. Speaking while working is discouraged or punished. Discussions among slaves are viewed with suspicion, potential breeding grounds for discontent or resistance. Your thoughts remain trapped inside your head, with few outlets for expression. The resulting isolation magnifies your suffering, each slave an island of pain, connected to others only by proximity and shared circumstance. Even the smallest pleasures are contaminated. The brief satisfaction of hunger temporarily quieted comes with the knowledge that tomorrow's meal will be just as inadequate. The momentary relief of sitting after hours of standing is poisoned by awareness that you'll soon be ordered back to your feet. The flicker of human connection with a fellow slave carries the shadow of knowledge that they might be sold away tomorrow or worked to death within the month. Days off exist only during the most important religious festivals, and even then, slaves often work harder before and after to compensate. The concept of leisure remains foreign, a mysterious activity you observe in your masters but never experience yourself. Rest is not rejuvenation, but merely the minimum maintenance required to keep the human machine functioning. By the day's end, when you finally collapse onto your sleeping mat, your body aches from a dozen different strains and injuries. Your mind has retreated to a dull, protective numbness. You don't dream of escape or rebellion. Your imagination has been systematically crushed by exhaustion and routine. You dream only of momentary respites, a slightly larger portion of food, a task in the shade rather than direct sun, an overseer distracted enough to allow a brief pause in labor. This is your daily existence, a grinding cycle of work, inadequate recovery, and more work. Not a life, but a slow-motion consumption of your body and spirit in service to Egyptian prosperity. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, as will the day after, and every day until your body fails entirely. And when that happens, you'll be replaced as easily as a broken pot or worn-out sandal. Another interchangeable piece in Egypt's vast machinery of exploitation. Not all chains weigh the same in ancient Egypt. As you shuffle through your daily existence, you notice the invisible hierarchies even among the owned. Some slaves walk with slightly straighter backs. Others shuffle with the hollow-eyed look of the utterly broken. The type of slave you become often determines not just your daily tasks, but your lifespan, your suffering, and whatever small mercies might be available in a life of bondage. Household slaves represent what passes for the fortunate among the enslaved. If slavery is a pit, they occupy the uppermost level, still trapped, but with slightly more air to breathe. Working inside the master's home means protection from the killing Egyptian sun, access to scraps from better food, and the occasional cast-off clothing or sandals. The household slave might serve as a personal attendant, a cook, a cleaner, or a caretaker for children. Their value comes from proximity and intimacy. They know the master's routines, preferences, and secrets. But this privilege comes with its own special torments. The household slave never escapes supervision. Their every movement is watched, judged, and corrected. Make a bed improperly. Prepare food not to the master's taste. Fail to anticipate a need before it's spoken. Each mistake brings immediate consequence. The punishment might not be as physically brutal as a field slave would receive, but the psychological torture of constant scrutiny creates its own scars. Female household slaves face additional dangers. Their bodies are often considered part of the household amenities, available for the master's use or the entertainment of male guests. Resistance means beating or worse. Pregnancy resulting from these encounters creates children born into slavery, with the added cruelty that their father might be the very man who owns them. Some household slaves are specifically selected for their appearance, a different kind of curse disguised as favor. For household slaves, the boundary between person and possession blurs in confusing ways. You might be permitted to hold the master's child, even develop genuine affection for them, while being reminded daily that you are less than human. You might prepare elaborate meals you'll never taste, wash fine linens you'll never wear, and maintain living spaces you'll never have the right to enjoy. The constant exposure to comforts just beyond your reach becomes its own refined form of torture. Field slaves occupy the middle tier of this inverted hierarchy. Their lives revolve around Egypt's agricultural calendar: planting, irrigation, harvest. The work is backbreaking, performed under direct sun in temperatures that can reach 120 degrees. Field slaves move in choreographed lines through endless acres of wheat, barley, or flax, their bodies bent like human question marks. Overseers set the pace with shouts, counting cadence or singing work songs that serve as both timing mechanism and psychological control. The field slave's year never ends. Each season brings different tasks, but equal misery. During inundation, when the Nile floods, you might shore up dikes or clear irrigation channels, standing waist-deep in water thick with silt and parasites. During growing seasons, you weed and tend crops with obsessive precision. One damaged plant might earn you a lashing. At harvest, you work from first light until well past dark, your hands bleeding from grain husks and rough tools, your back screaming in protest. Field slaves live and die by the success of crops. A good harvest might mean slightly better rations. A poor one guarantees hunger as the master ensures his family's stores remain full while slave portions shrink. The seasons of scarcity reveal the true calculus of your worth, exactly how little they can feed you while keeping you productive enough to justify your continued existence. If household and field slaves occupy the upper and middle tiers of misery, construction and mining slaves dwell in the deepest pit of human suffering. These are often prisoners of war, criminals, or slaves being punished for insubordination. Their life expectancies can be measured in months rather than years. They are, in the coldest terms, disposable, worked until they break, then discarded and replaced. Construction slaves build the monuments that modern tourists photograph with awe. never considering the human cost embedded in each stone block. The massive temples, tombs, and palaces of Egypt rise on foundations of broken bodies and crushed spirits. You might be assigned to quarry work, chiseling stone from cliff faces with copper tools, your lungs filling with dust that will eventually suffocate you. Or perhaps you're a hauler, part of the human machinery that moves multi-ton blocks across miles of desert using nothing but muscle, rope, and crude wooden sledges. The work never stops. Pharaohs are impatient for their monuments, nobles compete to display their wealth, and temples must constantly expand to demonstrate proper devotion to the gods. Your body becomes a resource to be extracted like the stone itself, useful until it cracks, then left where it falls. The overseers for construction projects are the cruelest, selected specifically for their ability to push human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. Mining slaves experience the worst fate of all. Sent to gold mines in Nubia or turquoise mines in Sinai, they descend into narrow shafts cut through solid rock. The air is thin, filled with dust that coats your lungs like cement. Temperatures underground fluctuate between suffocating heat and bone-chilling cold. Cave-ins are common. Escape is impossible given the remote locations. These slaves are often chained even while working, their ankles rubbed raw by iron shackles. The average lifespan of a mining slave, perhaps a year. Your body fails systematically, first your lungs, then your joints, then your mind as the constant darkness and brutality crush whatever humanity remains. Water is scarce, food minimal, rest almost non-existent. When you finally collapse, your body might not even be retrieved from the tunnels. Why waste the effort? There's always another slave to take your place. Beyond these broad categories, specialized slaves occupy unique positions within Egyptian society. Temple slaves serve the priests and maintain religious complexes. Their lives revolve around ritual purification, preparation of offerings, and endless cleaning of sacred spaces. The work might be less physically demanding, but the standards are impossibly high. A single speck of dust or misplaced ritual object could be interpreted as an offense against the gods themselves. Some particularly skilled slaves work as artisans, creating furniture, pottery, jewelry, or textiles. Their talents earn them marginally better treatment, not out of respect for their humanity, but to protect the investment their skills represent. An accomplished slave carpenter or metalworker represents years of training that the master doesn't want damaged by excessive beatings or starvation. This creates the bitter irony of slaves who craft beautiful objects of comfort and luxury they themselves will never be permitted to own. Military slaves serve in supporting roles for Egypt's armies, not as warriors but as porters, cooks, animal handlers, and equipment maintainers. They follow campaigns into hostile territories, facing all the dangers of warfare without any of the glory or spoils. When the army faces defeat, these slaves are often the first sacrificed, left behind to delay enemy advances while Egyptian soldiers retreat. The pharaoh's slaves occupy a category of their own. Owned directly by Egypt's living god-king, they work in royal households, farms, and construction projects. The scale is different. While a noble might own dozens of slaves, the pharaoh possesses thousands. Some never see their divine owner, serving instead under layers of overseers and administrators. Others work in direct proximity to ultimate power, which brings both greater danger and occasional bizarre advantage. A slave who happens to catch the pharaoh's favorable notice might rise dramatically in status, though such lightning strikes of fortune are vanishingly rare. Foreign-born slaves face additional hardships. Beyond the usual brutalities of slavery, they struggle with language barriers, unfamiliar customs, and often racial prejudice. Nubians, Canaanites, Libyans, and other captured peoples are marked by their accents, appearance, and cultural practices. Some owners deliberately separate slaves who share a language or homeland, preventing them from forming communities that might foster resistance. The isolation magnifies their suffering, unable to fully communicate, stripped of cultural context, forced to adapt to Egyptian ways while being reminded they will never truly belong. For all slaves, their position in this hierarchy isn't fixed. Aging, injury, or simple bad luck can send a household slave to the fields or a field slave to the mines. Your status can plummet in an instant, break a valuable object, anger the master at the wrong moment, or simply be visible when someone needs to make an example. The possibility of demotion hangs over every slave like a shadow, adding another layer of anxiety to already unbearable lives. Children born into each category inherit their parents' status, but often with an accelerated introduction to its hardships. The child of field slaves might be put to work scaring birds from crops as soon as they can walk. The offspring of household slaves become tiny servants, fetching and carrying before their 5th year. The children of mining or construction slaves rarely survive infancy, given the conditions their parents endure. Age brings no relief in this system. Elderly slaves who can no longer perform their assigned tasks don't receive a peaceful retirement. Instead, they're relegated to whatever simple work their failing bodies can manage: grinding grain, watching for thieves, or minding children. When they become completely unproductive, their fates depend entirely on their owner's whim. Some are simply abandoned to die. Others might be maintained at minimal expense if they've served long enough to earn some small measure of reluctant mercy. The rare possibility of freedom exists for some slaves, particularly those in households or with specialized skills. This practice of manumission, the formal granting of freedom, might come through years of loyal service, the payment of a substitute slave, or as a status symbol for particularly wealthy Egyptians. But freedom comes with complications. Where does a freed slave go? How do they support themselves in a society that has only trained them for servitude? Many freed slaves remain in their master's household as servants, their technical liberty meaning little in practical terms. Each type of slave faces different torments, different small mercies, different paths to broken bodies and crushed spirits. But all share the fundamental reality of being human property in a civilization that sees nothing wrong with owning people. From the household slave who polishes silver they'll never possess, to the mining slave who dies alone in darkness, the spectrum of slavery offers only variations in suffering, not its absence. As you move through your assigned role in this elaborate hierarchy of ownership, you develop an acute awareness of relative position. You learn to read the subtle markers: which slaves eat slightly better food, which receive marginally less brutal punishments, which might survive past 30. You navigate the complex social web of the enslaved, understanding intuitively that the household slave who catches the master's eye might wield more influence than an overseer. This hyper-awareness becomes both survival tactic and burden, another exhausting calculation in a life already defined by constant vigilance. No matter which category of slave you become, the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Your body, your labor, your very existence belongs to someone else. The variations in treatment are merely different notes in the same song of exploitation, some higher, some lower, but all part of the same relentless melody that defines life as an ancient Egyptian slave. Your body wasn't designed to endure what Egypt demands of it. Human anatomy, with its delicate joints, vulnerable spine, and finite muscular capacity, was never meant to haul multi-ton stone blocks or spend decades bent over irrigation ditches. Yet, this is precisely what your slave existence requires. The physical transformation begins almost immediately and progresses with merciless certainty. Your body becomes a living record of abuse, a flesh and bone diary of exploitation that archaeologists will someday read in your remains. The skeleton tells the clearest story. Modern archaeological examinations of slave burial sites reveal patterns of damage so consistent they've become diagnostic markers of bondage. Your spine, that column of vertebrae meant to support your frame in elegant balance, warps under loads it was never meant to bear. The lower vertebrae compress and deform. Bone spurs develop where muscle attachments tear repeatedly from excessive strain. Discs rupture and calcify. By 30, your back has the deterioration pattern of a modern 70-year-old with a lifetime of hard labor. Your shoulders fare no better. Carrying water, stone, or harvest loads using yokes and straps creates distinctive wear patterns in the shoulder joints. The glenoid cavity, the socket that cradles your arm bone, develops grooves and arthritic ridges. The clavicle thickens asymmetrically from uneven loading. Your shoulder blades show stress fractures that heal imperfectly, creating a permanent record of the weights you've borne. The joint itself begins to degrade, cartilage wearing away until bone grinds against bone with every movement. Knees collapse next. Constant kneeling to grind grain, scrub floors, or work low crops creates distinctive wear patterns on the patella and tibial plateau. The cartilage, meant to cushion your movements for decades, erodes by your 20th year. Each step brings the grating sensation of damaged joints. The knee joints of elderly slaves often fuse entirely, the body's desperate attempt to prevent further damage by sacrificing mobility. You develop a characteristic gait, slightly bow-legged, hesitant, each step placed with unconscious calculation to minimize pain. Your hands transform from tools of dexterity to gnarled claws. Fingers break and heal crookedly. Joints swell with arthritis before you reach full adulthood. The metacarpal bones thicken from constant stress. Your fingernails grow ridged and deformed from nutritional deficiencies and trauma. The skin hardens into calluses so thick they crack and bleed in the dry Egyptian air. You lose sensation in your fingertips, nerve endings deadened by repetitive trauma and the body's attempt to armor itself against further damage. Feet flatten and splay under constant load-bearing. Walking barefoot on hot sand, sharp stones, and rough surfaces creates a distinctive pattern of wear. The skin thickens to leather-like consistency, cracking painfully in the dry season. Hookworms and other parasites enter through these cracks, causing internal damage while leaving characteristic lesions archaeologists will someday identify as markers of slave status. Broken toes heal without treatment, often at unnatural angles. The arches collapse entirely in older slaves, creating a shuffling gait that overseers recognize as the mark of a used-up worker. Your teeth tell their own story of suffering. The coarse bread that forms your dietary staple contains stone grit from the grinding process, which acts like sandpaper on your enamel. By 20, your molars are worn to the pulp, exposing nerves and creating constant pain. Abscesses form with no treatment available except extraction, if you're lucky enough to have a skilled slave who knows how to remove teeth without shattering the jaw. Many slaves' remains show evidence of missing teeth lost decades before death, with jawbones that remodeled around the gaps. Muscle development follows patterns so specific that archaeologists can identify slave remains by them alone. Your dominant arm develops significantly more mass and bone density than your non-dominant side, an asymmetry far more pronounced than in free Egyptians. Certain muscle attachments, particularly in the upper back and thighs, show enlargement and stress indicators from repetitive heavy lifting. But this isn't the balanced musculature of an athlete. It's the distorted development of a human body used as a machine, with some parts overbuilt and others wasted. Your height tells another tale of deprivation. Slave skeletons average several inches shorter than their free Egyptian counterparts. Childhood malnutrition stunts growth during critical development periods. The bones themselves are often thinner, with decreased density indicating periods of severe caloric restriction. Growth arrest lines appear as visible markers in long bones, recording each famine or illness that temporarily halted your development. Your body literally stops growing when resources become too scarce, prioritizing survival over development. The skin, that largest of organs, bears perhaps the most visible record of your bondage. The Egyptian sun damages exposed flesh with merciless efficiency. Without the oils and protective treatments available to the upper classes, your skin ages decades ahead of schedule. Deep wrinkles form by your 20s. The epidermis thickens and darkens in exposed areas, a natural but insufficient defense against ultraviolet radiation. Skin cancers develop, but go untreated, creating lesions that ulcerate and scar. Your hands and face become almost unrecognizable compared to the skin of protected areas, as though belonging to two different people of widely separated ages. Then there are the specific injuries, the brutal punctuation marks in this ongoing sentence of physical deterioration. Fractures heal poorly without proper setting, creating limbs that function but remain visibly deformed. Scar tissue builds up layer by layer from lashings, forming ridged patterns across backs and shoulders. Archaeological evidence shows some slave skeletons with defensive fractures of the forearm, the instinctive response to raise an arm against a blow to the face. These healed fractures create a physical record of violence so routine it becomes predictable. Internal damage remains invisible, but no less devastating. Your respiratory system suffers constant assault. If you work construction, stone dust coats your lungs with each breath, creating silicosis that slowly suffocates you from the inside. Kitchen slaves inhale smoke daily, their lungs blackening over decades of cooking over open fires in poorly ventilated spaces. Field slaves breathe agricultural dust, fungal spores, and plant particles that trigger inflammatory responses. Your cough becomes as much a part of you as your voice, a constant companion that worsens until breathing itself becomes labored work. Your digestive system deteriorates under the strain of poor nutrition and parasitic infestation. The intestines of slave remains show evidence of multiple parasitic worms, hookworms, tapeworms, flukes, all competing for what little nutrition your inadequate diet provides. These unwelcome inhabitants cause chronic diarrhea, intestinal bleeding, and malabsorption that exacerbates your malnutrition. Your stomach lining thins from irregular meals, developing ulcers that burn constantly. The pain becomes so familiar, you stop recognizing it as abnormal, just another background note in your symphony of discomfort. Even your sensory organs pay the price of slavery. Eyes develop cataracts decades earlier than they should from constant sun exposure. Fine dust damages the cornea, creating opacities that blur your vision. Household slaves who work intricate details by inadequate lamplight develop severe myopia, their world gradually shrinking to whatever lies within arm's reach. Hearing dulls from the constant concussive noise of construction or the high-pitched whine of grinding stones. Gradual hearing loss isolates you further, making every command a potential trap. Did you fail to respond because you didn't hear, or because you were being insubordinate? Female slaves face additional physical traumas. Repeated pregnancies without adequate nutrition or recovery time leave lasting damage. Pelvic bones show evidence of childbirth injuries, some catastrophic. Repeated lifting and labor during pregnancy causes distinctive patterns of spinal damage. Breast infections go untreated, leaving evidence of healed abscesses. The female slave's body is doubly exploited, for both labor and reproduction, and the physical record reflects this compounded abuse. The immune system, though invisible to archaeological investigation, surely suffered under the constant stress of slavery. Modern medical science confirms that chronic stress suppresses immune function, leaving the body vulnerable to infection and disease. Ancient slave populations experienced waves of infectious disease that spread rapidly through crowded living quarters. Those who survived developed immunity, but at tremendous cost. Your body diverts precious resources to fight these infections, leaving less for repair and maintenance of already stressed systems. Sleep deprivation adds another layer of physical deterioration. Without adequate rest, your body cannot repair daily damage. Tissues remain inflamed, muscles don't recover, neurological function declines. The human body requires approximately 8 hours of sleep for optimal function. You average perhaps 5, often fragmented by discomfort, overcrowding, or night duties. This sleep debt accumulates, never repaid, creating a constant state of physical and cognitive impairment that becomes your baseline normal. Dehydration leaves its own markers. In Egypt's climate, water loss through sweat can exceed 2 liters per hour during heavy labor. Without adequate replacement, your kidneys develop stones, crystalline formations that pass with excruciating pain. Urine becomes concentrated, irritating the bladder and urethra. The brain, deprived of optimal fluid levels, functions at reduced capacity. Chronic mild dehydration becomes your constant state, adding foggy thinking to your physical burdens. The evidence of physical abuse appears with such regularity in slave remains that forensic anthropologists use it as a diagnostic tool. Healed fractures in particular patterns, defensive forearm breaks, spiral fractures from twisting violence, depressed skull fractures from blunt force trauma, all tell the story of routine brutality. Unlike accidental injuries, which show random distribution, slave injuries follow patterns consistent with specific types of punishment and control. By the time you reach 30, ancient by slave standards, your body has transformed into a living map of exploitation. You move differently, hunched and cautious. You breathe differently, shallow and labored. You process pain differently, filtering out the constant background aches to focus only on new or intensified discomfort. Your physical appearance marks you clearly as a slave, even without chains or identifying garments. The body adapts to survive, but that adaptation comes at tremendous cost. Perhaps most disturbing is how this physical deterioration accelerates over time. The damage is not linear, but exponential. Each injury makes the next more likely. Each nutritional deficiency makes it harder to recover from exertion. Each infection weakens your resistance to the next. The slave's body enters a downward spiral from which there is no escape except death, which, in the bitter calculus of Egyptian slavery, simply means replacement with another body to be broken in turn. For all the evidence that archaeologists can read from bones, what remains invisible is the physical experience of living in this deteriorating vessel. The constant grinding pain that becomes so familiar, you stop recognizing it as abnormal. The bone-deep fatigue that no amount of rest seems to touch. The sensation of your body betraying you bit by bit, day by day. Less capable, less responsive, less yours with each sunrise. This lived experience of physical deterioration constitutes the most intimate dimension of slavery, recorded not in artifacts or inscriptions, but in the flesh itself. When your body finally collapses, whether gradually through accumulated damage or suddenly through injury or disease, your remains might join the anonymous mass graves archaeologists now study. Your bones will lie among others who shared your fate, your physical suffering finally ended, your skeleton a silent witness to what Egypt demanded of those it owned. Your legacy becomes the evidence extracted from your remains, calcium and collagen testifying to what hieroglyphs and temple paintings deliberately omit. The brutal physical reality of building an empire on broken bodies. While your body bears the visible marks of slavery, your mind endures wounds no archaeologist will ever excavate. The psychological damage of bondage leaves no traces in burial sites, no skeletal indicators, no material evidence. Yet it constitutes perhaps the most profound dimension of the slave experience. Egyptian slavery wasn't just a system of physical control. It was an architecture of mental domination designed to crush the human spirit so thoroughly that resistance became unthinkable. The foundation of this psychological torture is the systematic destruction of personhood. From your earliest awareness, you absorb the message that you are not fully human. The Egyptian language itself enforces this reality. The hieroglyphs used to describe slaves depict bound captives or use determinatives associated with property rather than people. You're recorded in inventories alongside cattle and furniture. Your value is calculated in terms of productivity, not humanity. This constant reinforcement of your status as object rather than person creates a cognitive dissonance that never resolves. You experience yourself as human while being treated as something less. Unpredictability becomes a weapon wielded against your sanity. The rules governing your existence shift without warning or explanation. A behavior tolerated yesterday earns a beating today. Work considered acceptable last week suddenly fails to meet standards. This inconsistency isn't accidental. It's a deliberate strategy to maintain psychological control. When you cannot predict the consequences of your actions, you exist in a state of perpetual anxiety. Every interaction becomes potentially dangerous. Every moment carries the possibility of punishment for reasons you cannot foresee or understand. The masters and overseers become gods in your mental landscape, omnipotent beings whose whims dictate your reality. Their moods shape your existence more definitively than the rising and setting of the sun. You develop hypervigilance, constantly scanning for subtle signals, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in posture, a particular quality of silence that might indicate impending violence. This state of constant alertness prevents true rest even during sleep. Your dreams fill with their faces, their voices, their unpredictable rage. Your brain, marinating in stress hormones, restructures itself around the imperative of threat detection. Perhaps most insidious is the forced complicity in your own dehumanization. To survive, you must participate in the systems that oppress you. You learn to anticipate the master's needs before they're expressed. You enforce rules against fellow slaves that you know are unjust. You suppress your own reactions to abuse and present the docile demeanor expected of property. This collaboration with your own oppression creates a particularly painful form of self-alienation. Part of you becomes overseer to the rest, always watching, always judging, always ready to suppress any spark of resistance or dignity that might trigger punishment. The destruction of autonomy cuts to the core of human psychological needs. Every decision, from when you sleep to when you relieve yourself, falls under external control. The most intimate aspects of existence, bathing, elimination, sexuality, occur under supervision or regulation. This comprehensive denial of choice creates a condition psychologists now call learned helplessness, where the mind eventually stops seeking control even when opportunities arise. Your capacity for independent decision-making atrophies through disuse. Initiative becomes dangerous. Compliance becomes reflexive. Isolation serves as another psychological weapon. Though surrounded by fellow slaves, true connection remains dangerous. Deep attachments make you vulnerable. Loved ones become hostages to your good behavior. Authorities deliberately separate family units, prevent the formation of close friendships, and disrupt any community that might offer emotional support. The resulting loneliness isn't just painful, it's existentially disorienting. Humans evolved as social creatures who define themselves partly through relationships. Without these connections, your sense of self erodes. You exist in a crowd yet remain fundamentally alone. Shame becomes a constant companion, carefully cultivated by those who own you. Your body's natural functions, sweating, elimination, menstruation, sexual response, are treated as disgusting when they occur in a slave. Your accent, your mannerisms, your cultural practices from before captivity become subjects of mockery. The physical signs of your suffering, scars, malnutrition, physical deformities from labor, are presented as evidence of your inherent inferiority rather than the results of abuse. This internalized shame creates a wound that never heals, a quiet voice that whispers you deserve your suffering. Time itself becomes a psychological torment. Slavery offers no narrative arc, no progress toward resolution. Unlike even the longest prison sentence, it stretches before you without endpoint or possibility of parole. The eternal sameness of days without hope of change creates what modern psychologists would call temporal compression, a distortion where time simultaneously drags unbearably and loses all meaning. Your mind struggles to project into a future that contains nothing but more of the same suffering. Memory becomes dangerous territory, filled with comparisons to better times or reminders of losses too painful to contemplate. Your very identity dissolves under these conditions. Names change at the master's whim. You might be called by your function, water carrier, grain grinder, a physical characteristic, tall one, scarred, or simply slave. Cultural practices that once defined you, language, religious observances, food traditions, music, are forbidden or forgotten through lack of opportunity to practice them. Without these anchors, your sense of continuity fractures. The person you were before captivity becomes a stranger, separated from your current self by an unbridgeable gulf of experience. Religious beliefs offer complicated psychological territory. Egyptian theological systems justify your enslavement as part of Ma'at, the divine order that structures the universe. The gods themselves own slaves. Pharaoh, a living god, possesses thousands. How can you question an institution sanctioned by divinity? Yet paradoxically, religious thought sometimes provides psychological survival tools. Private prayers offer moments of autonomy. Belief in an afterlife where social hierarchies might be reversed creates space for hope. The concept of an immaterial car or soul that remains free, regardless of the body's bondage, preserves a core of identity beyond the master's reach. Dreams become both sanctuary and torment. In sleep, you might briefly experience freedom, dignity, or reunion with lost loved ones. These respites, however temporary, preserve the psychological experience of alternatives to slavery. Yet waking from such dreams brings a renewed shock of reality, a fresh confrontation with bondage that can be more painful than never having tasted freedom at all. Some slaves report recurring nightmares of capture, separation from family, or punishment, the traumatized mind processing and reprocessing its wounds even in sleep. The psychological torture extends to imposed ignorance. Slaves are deliberately kept illiterate, denied access to information beyond their immediate tasks. This enforced ignorance serves practical control purposes, but also creates profound psychological limitation. Your world shrinks to immediate surroundings. Your understanding of causes and effects remains simplistic. Abstract thinking, long-term planning, and conceptual reasoning atrophy through lack of exercise and opportunity. The mind, like a muscle confined in too small a space, cannot grow to its natural capacity. Witnessing the suffering of fellow slaves creates another dimension of psychological damage. You watch people you've known for years break under the weight of bondage, some through physical collapse, others through mental breakdown, still others through suicide. These witnessings force an impossible choice between emotional numbing, protecting yourself by ceasing to care, or empathic traumatization, remaining human by feeling the full horror of what you observe. Neither option leaves you psychologically intact. For slaves who serve in household positions, psychological warfare takes subtle forms. You're forced to participate in the intimate life of the family that owns you, bathing their children, preparing their celebrations, standing invisibly present during their most private moments. This false intimacy creates cognitive dissonance. You know these people completely, yet remain fundamentally excluded from their humanity. Sometimes worse, they might show occasional kindness or recognition that creates confusion and inappropriate gratitude. The psychological term trauma bonding describes this phenomenon, developing attachment to those who control your existence, even when they abuse you. Sexual exploitation adds profound layers of psychological damage, particularly for female slaves, but sometimes for males as well. Your body becomes doubly owned, not just for labor, but for pleasure. The resulting trauma combines physical violation with the destruction of sexual autonomy and intimate boundaries. Children conceived through such exploitation inhabit an impossible psychological space, born of violence yet connected to both oppressor and oppressed. For the enslaved mother, the child becomes simultaneously precious and a living reminder of violation. The rare possibility of manumission, freedom, creates its own psychological torture. The dangled prospect of eventual release serves as a control mechanism, encouraging compliance and extraordinary effort. Most slaves never achieve freedom, but the possibility, however remote, prevents complete surrender to the reality of permanent bondage. This state of suspended hope creates a particular form of suffering, neither fully accepting current reality nor completely free to reject it. Modern psychologists would recognize this as a deliberately maintained trauma state where integration and healing become impossible. Perhaps most devastating is the psychological condition slaves develop that has no ancient name, but which modern psychology would identify as identity annihilation. The systematic attack on personhood, autonomy, connection, and dignity eventually breaks something fundamental in human psychological structure. You continue physically functioning while experiencing an internal emptiness, a sense that the person you were meant to be has been murdered, leaving only a functioning shell that walks, works, and responds to commands. This condition represents not just suffering, but a form of psychological death that precedes physical ending. For those who somehow maintain an internal core of selfhood despite these assaults, resistance takes primarily psychological forms, maintaining private thoughts the master cannot access, preserving cultural memories through whispered stories after dark, finding tiny choices within the rigid constraints of bondage, the precise way you complete a task, the internal narratives you construct, the moments of connection with fellow slaves. These microscopically small exercises of autonomy preserve crucial sparks of humanity against overwhelming pressure to surrender it completely. What's most remarkable about the psychological dimension of Egyptian slavery isn't the damage inflicted, though that was comprehensive and profound, but rather the evidence that many slaves maintained some form of internal resistance despite everything designed to break them. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals small acts of defiance, intentionally broken tools, hidden personal items, culturally significant objects preserved despite prohibition. These physical traces hint at the invisible psychological resilience that allowed some enslaved people to preserve fragments of identity, dignity, and humanity against a system engineered to destroy all three. The psychological torture of Egyptian slavery created wounds that, unlike physical injuries, could never fully heal. Even those rare individuals who achieved freedom carried these invisible scars: hypervigilance, identity fragmentation, learned helplessness, and profound grief for the self that might have existed under conditions of liberty. The true horror of Egyptian slavery lies not just in what was done to bodies, but in what was systematically dismantled in minds. The deliberate unmaking of human beings into objects, a process that attacked the very essence of what makes us human. The physical and psychological devastation of Egyptian slavery didn't happen by accident. It resulted from sophisticated, deliberate systems of control refined over centuries. The Egyptians developed a comprehensive architecture of domination, physical, psychological, and social, designed to transform human beings into compliant tools. These methods were not crude improvisations, but carefully calibrated techniques passed down through generations of overseers, scribes, and slave owners who understood exactly how to break the human spirit while preserving just enough function to extract maximum labor. Physical restraints form the most visible layer of this control system. Contrary to popular depictions that show Egyptian slaves working unbound, archaeological evidence reveals a different reality. Copper and bronze shackles, often lined with leather to prevent immediate skin damage, not from compassion but to maintain work capacity, bound wrists and ankles of high flight risk slaves. These weren't always permanent fixtures. Many slaves were chained only during transportation or as punishment. But the physical experience of restraint served as a powerful psychological reinforcement of captivity. Neck yokes, constructed of wood with leather padding, served dual purposes. Beyond the obvious physical restraint, they marked slaves visually as property. Some yokes connected multiple slaves together, forcing synchronized movement and preventing individual escape attempts. The yoke's design distributed weight specifically to create discomfort without injury, another example of control calibrated to maximize work capacity while crushing autonomy. The removal of these restraints after periods of compliant behavior created a perverse sense of gratitude toward the oppressor, a psychological manipulation disguised as mercy. The whip stands as the quintessential symbol of slave control for good reason. Egyptian overseers carried several types: light cords for minor corrections, heavier leather whips for serious discipline, and multi-tailed scourges for extreme punishment. Whipping techniques were refined to an art. The ability to cause intense pain without inflicting permanent damage that would reduce a slave's work capacity represented a valued skill. Archaeological evidence from slave remains shows distinctive scarring patterns on back, shoulders, and legs consistent with systematic whipping, confirming that this wasn't just a threat but a routine practice. Beyond these obvious implements, Egyptian slave control employed more subtle physical techniques. Food and water allocation served as both reward and punishment. Rations were calculated with mathematical precision to provide minimum sustenance for continued labor while maintaining a constant state of mild hunger. Extra food became a powerful motivator, reduced rations an effective punishment. This calibrated deprivation kept slaves focused on immediate physical needs rather than long-term resistance or escape planning. The body's desperate focus on survival crowds out thoughts of rebellion. Sleep deprivation functioned as another control mechanism disguised as work necessity. Slaves were permitted just enough rest to prevent complete physical collapse, but not enough for full recovery or mental clarity. This chronic exhaustion served strategic purposes beyond maximizing work hours. Sleep-deprived humans become more compliant, less capable of complex planning, and more susceptible to suggestion. Your cognitive function remains permanently impaired, making resistance or escape planning exponentially more difficult. The foggy-headed confusion of sleep deprivation becomes your normal state of existence. Branding and physical marking created permanent visible indicators of slave status. Some slaves were marked with hot iron, leaving scars that identified their owner or status. Others received tattoos, pigment inserted into punctured skin using bronze needles. These marks served practical purposes, identifying runaways, establishing ownership, but also psychological ones. The permanent alteration of your body without your consent reinforces your status as property. Each time you glimpse the mark, you're reminded of your commodification. Some particularly valuable slaves received distinctive hairstyles or ear notches, rather than damaging marks that might reduce their market value. The architecture of control extended beyond direct physical restraint to encompass living environments. Slave quarters were deliberately designed with control in mind. Single entrances easily guarded, no privacy, and often direct visibility to overseers' quarters. Archaeological excavations of slave housing at construction sites show buildings specifically designed to prevent escape. High walls, minimal windows placed too high to reach, and sometimes even locking mechanisms operable only from outside. Your living space itself becomes a prison, your movements constrained even during nominal rest hours. Surveillance formed another constant in slave existence. Nothing you did occurred unwatched. Overseers positioned themselves strategically to maintain visual contact with working slaves. Fellow slaves were appointed as informants, reporting rule violations in exchange for slightly better treatment. Even in sleeping quarters, supervisory slaves maintained watch. This omnipresent observation created a state modern psychologists would recognize as similar to panopticon effects. You begin to internalize the watching eye, monitoring and censoring your own behavior, even when temporarily unobserved. The overseer class itself represented a specialized control mechanism. These weren't random appointees, but individuals specifically selected and trained for the role. Many were former slaves themselves, chosen for their capacity to enforce rules against their own people. Their elevated but still subordinate position created complex dynamics. They identified upward with authority, rather than downward with those they supervised. Their techniques combined intimate knowledge of slave psychology with formalized control methods passed down through generations of practice. The most effective overseers were those who could predict resistance before it formed and crush it preemptively. Punishment systems operated with calculated public theatricality. Discipline was rarely private. Violations received correction before assembled slaves to maximize the instructional impact. Minor infractions might earn public whipping. More serious violations brought escalating consequences. Time in punishment stocks, branding, mutilation of ears or nose, or transfer to more dangerous work sites like mines or quarries. The ultimate punishment, execution, occurred rarely, not from mercy, but from cold economic calculation. A dead slave represented lost investment. Better to make an example through non-lethal but permanently visible punishment. Divide and conquer techniques prevented solidarity among slaves. Authorities deliberately created hierarchies, privileges, and competitions within slave populations. slightly better food, marginally improved sleeping arrangements, or reduced physical punishment became powerful motivators when survival margins were so thin. Cultural and linguistic differences were exploited and amplified. Foreign-born slaves were mixed with Egyptian-born ones to prevent communication and shared planning. Rewards for reporting escape plans or rule violations turned potential allies into threats. The resulting environment of suspicion prevented the formation of the trust networks necessary for collective resistance. Religious control added another dimension to Egyptian slave management. State religion justified slavery as part of Ma'at, the divine order established by the gods. Pharaoh, a living god, owned thousands of slaves. How could the institution be wrong? Slaves were permitted limited religious participation, but within carefully controlled contexts that reinforced their subordinate status. Temple iconography consistently depicted slaves as naturally inferior beings. Divine punishment was invoked to explain suffering. Your hardships weren't the result of human cruelty, but cosmic justice for some unknowable spiritual failing. This theological framework made resistance not just dangerous, but sacrilegious. Even language served as a control mechanism. The terms used for slaves in hieroglyphic texts explicitly dehumanized them. Determinative symbols grouped them with property rather than people. Slaves were not permitted to use certain vocabulary or speech patterns reserved for free Egyptians. Their names were changed to Egyptian ones, erasing cultural identity. Communication between slaves speaking different native languages was discouraged or prohibited entirely. This linguistic isolation prevented information sharing and reinforced individual powerlessness against the system. Sexual control represented one of the most intimate dimensions of slave management. Female slaves' bodies were considered available to owners, overseers, or anyone granted access by authorities. This vulnerability created not just physical trauma, but strategic control. The constant threat of sexual violence encouraged compliance and discouraged resistance. Pregnancy resulting from such exploitation created additional bonds of control, as children became both hostages to good behavior and new generations of enslaved labor. Male slaves weren't exempt from sexual exploitation, though it took different forms. Their sexuality was controlled through deliberate emasculation, not necessarily physical castration, though this occurred in some contexts, but systematic denial of normal male social roles and family authority. Control extended even to death and burial. Egyptian religious culture placed enormous emphasis on proper funeral practices and preparation for the afterlife. Slaves were systematically denied these spiritual necessities. Your body after death might be disposed of with minimal ceremony, tossed into mass graves or left exposed. No preservation techniques, no grave goods, no prayers or rituals to ensure safe passage to the afterlife. This final indignity, the denial of proper transition to whatever lies beyond, represented the ultimate control. Dominion extending beyond physical life into spiritual existence. The most sophisticated control mechanism, however, was the occasional strategic grant of small freedoms or privileges. These weren't acts of kindness, but calculated management techniques. A slave permitted to keep a personal possession, allowed to visit a family member on another estate, or granted slightly better food, created a psychology of gratitude entirely disproportionate to the gift. These occasional mercies prevented complete despair while creating psychological dependencies. They fostered hope that compliance might bring more privileges, a hope that discouraged risk-taking and resistance. This carrot and stick approach represented psychological manipulation of the highest order. Time itself was weaponized as a control mechanism. Your day was structured to the minute, with activities scheduled and monitored according to precise timekeeping methods. This chronological regimentation prevented any sense of temporal autonomy. Even your experience of time belonged to your masters. The schedule deliberately prevented adequate rest between tasks, creating a perpetual state of physical and mental exhaustion. Time became not a neutral medium, but another dimension of bondage, every moment accounted for and controlled by external authority. Perhaps most insidious were the mechanisms that forced complicity in your own oppression. Slaves were required to participate in punishing other slaves, to report rule violations, to enforce standards against their fellows. This forced participation in the control system created profound psychological damage. To maintain your survival, you became partly responsible for others' suffering. This complicity generated shame, self-loathing, and division within slave communities. It represented the ultimate victory of the control system, the transformation of the oppressed into instruments of their own oppression. What made Egyptian slave control systems particularly effective was their comprehensive nature. Physical restraint, psychological manipulation, environmental design, social engineering, religious justification, linguistic limitation, sexual exploitation, and temporal control operated not as separate mechanisms, but as integrated components of a unified system. Each reinforced the others. Each closed potential avenues of resistance. Each contributed to the fundamental goal, the transformation of human beings into property, the conversion of people into tools that could be used, maintained, and eventually discarded without moral consequence. The archaeological and textual evidence reveals a control system of chilling sophistication, one that understood human psychology and exploited vulnerabilities with precision. The true horror of Egyptian slavery lies not just in its cruelty, but in its calculated efficiency. The cold, systematic application of domination techniques refined over centuries to maximize extraction of labor while minimizing resistance. These weren't accidental discoveries, but deliberate methods, passed from overseer to overseer, owner to owner, generation to generation. A dark technology of human control that achieved its terrible purpose with devastating effectiveness. Despite the sophisticated architecture of control, the human spirit proves remarkably resilient. Even under the most crushing oppression, resistance finds ways to manifest, sometimes in dramatic acts of rebellion, more often in subtle forms of defiance, so carefully disguised they leave little trace in the historical record. Egyptian slavery was designed to break the will completely, yet archaeological and textual evidence reveals that slaves consistently found ways to resist the systems that sought to reduce them to compliant tools. The quietest forms of resistance occurred in daily labor, work slowdowns, deliberately performing tasks at reduced speed while maintaining the appearance of effort became a refined art. You learn to calibrate your pace precisely, slow enough to reclaim tiny fragments of autonomy, fast enough to avoid punishment. This collective practice, what modern labor organizers would call working to rule, appears in Egyptian records as complaints about slave productivity that periodically spike, despite no obvious changes in conditions, likely reflecting coordinated strategic slowdowns. Feigned illness offered another avenue of resistance, disguised as incapacity. Symptoms difficult to verify, stomach pains, dizziness, weakness, provided temporary escape from the most grueling tasks. These performance strategies required careful calibration. Too frequent or unconvincing displays brought punishment, while successful simulations offered brief respite. Medical papyri include specialized sections for slave owners on distinguishing genuine illness from malingering, suggesting this resistance strategy was common enough to warrant formal countermeasures. Accidental damage to tools, materials, or crops provided another outlet for resistance. Dropping valuable items, breaking tools through clumsy handling, or allowing food to spoil through oversight created small victories against the master's property and interests. The key to this strategy was plausible deniability. The damage had to appear consistent with genuine accident, rather than deliberate sabotage. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals tool damage patterns inconsistent with normal wear, but perfectly aligned with deliberate breaking, silent testimony to these small acts of defiance. Language became a crucial resistance zone. Slaves developed coded communications, incomprehensible to overseers, double meanings, metaphorical systems, and repurposed Egyptian terms that conveyed secret messages. Work songs, permitted because they maintained labor rhythm, often contained veiled expressions of resistance or suffering. Foreign-born slaves maintained their native languages in secret, preserving both cultural identity and a private communication channel beyond Egyptian control. Some evidence suggests slaves developed simplified hybrid languages, combining elements from multiple tongues, early creoles that facilitated communication while excluding the masters. Cultural preservation represented another form of resistance. Despite prohibitions, slaves maintained religious practices, storytelling traditions, music, and dance from their homelands. These cultural expressions occurred in stolen moments, brief interludes in sleeping quarters, whispered stories after dark, songs hummed under breath during work. Archaeological findings occasionally include small artifacts inconsistent with Egyptian design, but matching cultural practices of Nubia, Canaan, or Libya. Tiny talismans, distinctive beads, or figurines hidden among slave possessions. These cultural anchors preserved identity against systematic efforts to erase it. Memory became a battlefield where resistance occurred invisibly. Slaves passed down oral histories detailing their origins, genealogies, and cultural knowledge, information that contradicted Egyptian narratives about slave inferiority or natural servitude. These memory practices preserved alternative truths that challenged the ideological foundations of slavery. Names represented a particular focus of memory resistance. While masters imposed Egyptian names, true names from homelands were preserved in secret, passed between generations as precious inheritance, maintaining connections to identity beyond captivity. Physical escape attempts, though dramatically riskier than these subtle resistance forms, occurred with surprising frequency. Egyptian records document considerable resources devoted to recapturing fugitive slaves, suggesting escape was common enough to warrant systematic countermeasures. Papyri contain standardized forms for reporting escaped slaves, including detailed physical descriptions, height, distinguishing marks, language abilities, and offering rewards for return. These administrative documents reveal that escape was not exceptional, but an ongoing management challenge requiring institutional response. The geography of Egypt presented severe challenges for escape. The narrow strip of habitable land along the Nile meant fugitives had limited directions for flight. Desert regions offered no sustainable alternative to Nile Valley life, while marshes hosted dangerous wildlife and limited food sources. Natural barriers complemented human systems of control. Border checkpoints, regular patrols, and networks of informants incentivized to report suspicious travelers. Despite these obstacles, archaeological evidence occasionally reveals small communities in marginal areas, desert edges, or deep marshes that may have included escaped slaves, creating alternative lives beyond Egyptian control. When recaptured, escaped slaves faced particularly brutal punishments, designed not just to penalize the individual, but to deter others. Branding, facial mutilation, hamstring cutting, or transfer to mining operations served both as punishment and warning. Some punishment records specify public applications specifically to instruct other slaves. Despite these terrifying consequences, escape attempts continued, testament to the profound human drive for freedom that persists even when success seems impossible and failure guarantees severe suffering. Beyond individual escape, collective resistance occurred through coordinated work actions. Periodic labor disruptions appear in administrative records as mysterious productivity collapses, requiring investigative response. These weren't modern strikes with explicit demands, but synchronized slowdowns or temporary work stoppages disguised as confusion or misunderstanding. Reconstructing these events from fragmentary records suggests subtle coordination among slave populations, likely through the same coded communication systems used for everyday resistance. Open rebellion, mass violent resistance, represents the most dramatic but least successful form of slave resistance in ancient Egypt. Unlike later slave societies where major uprisings periodically threatened the entire system, Egyptian records contain few accounts of large-scale slave rebellions. This absence likely reflects both the effectiveness of Egyptian control mechanisms and the geographical constraints of the Nile Valley environment, which limited rebel mobility and sustainability. The most significant documented slave revolt occurred during the Middle Kingdom period, approximately 2000 BCE, when administrative texts describe a disturbance of captives requiring military response. The fragmented record suggests hundreds of slaves at a construction site organized armed resistance, briefly controlled a small territory, and were ultimately suppressed with significant casualties. The aftermath brought intensified control measures across Egyptian slaveholding operations, indicating authorities recognized the potential threat collective action represented. Smaller-scale violent resistance appears more frequently in the record. Individual attacks on overseers, sabotage of critical equipment, or coordinated disruption of key operations. These isolated incidents rarely succeeded in creating lasting change, but occasionally won temporary concessions in living conditions or work requirements. More significantly, they forced the system to acknowledge, however briefly, the humanity and agency of those it sought to reduce to passive tools. Solidarity among slaves, mutual support despite the system's divide-and-conquer strategies, constituted perhaps the most powerful form of resistance. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals food-sharing patterns inconsistent with official ration distribution, suggesting slaves redistributed resources to support the most vulnerable among them. Records complaining about inexplicable healing of injured slaves hint at secret medical care provided by fellow captives with traditional knowledge. These solidarity practices directly countered the isolation and competition the system deliberately fostered. Communication networks between slave populations at different locations represented a particularly sophisticated resistance strategy. Despite prohibitions on travel or information sharing, evidence suggests slaves developed methods to transmit news between work sites, households, and regions. Traveling merchants, reassigned slaves, or work groups temporarily brought together for special projects served as information conduits. These networks transmitted crucial intelligence about conditions in different locations, owner behaviors, and successful resistance tactics. Egyptian authorities repeated prohibitions against specific forms of slave communication indirectly document the resilience of these information exchanges. Religious and magical practices offered another resistance domain. While Egyptian authorities permitted limited slave participation in state religion, archaeological evidence reveals secret maintenance of homeland spiritual traditions. Small amulets, ritual markings in hidden locations, or distinctive burial practices, when slaves could control these, preserved alternative cosmologies that contradicted Egyptian justifications for slavery. Some slave groups apparently developed syncretic practices combining elements of Egyptian religion with homeland traditions, creating spiritual systems that address their specific needs for meaning and hope under oppression. For female slaves, resistance often took gender-specific forms. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals contraceptive materials among slave women's possessions, herbs and substances known to prevent conception. This reproductive resistance represented control over one of the few bodily domains not completely dominated by masters. Women also developed collective childcare systems that allowed mothers assigned to different work areas to ensure their children's survival through shared supervision and care, a form of mutual aid that directly countered the system's attempts to break family bonds. The psychological dimension of resistance may have been most significant, yet leaves the faintest historical trace. Maintaining internal dignity despite external degradation, preserving hope despite daily evidence of its futility, and sustaining a conception of self beyond slave despite systematic identity erasure all represented profound resistance. These interior forms of defiance created psychological space the system could never fully colonize, a private territory where freedom remained possible even when physically unrealizable. What's remarkable about slave resistance in ancient Egypt isn't its occasional dramatic manifestations, but its persistent, adaptive nature. Faced with comprehensive systems of control refined over centuries, slaves continuously developed countermeasures that evolved in response to changing repressive techniques. This dynamic opposition, control systems becoming more sophisticated as resistance strategies evolved, and resistance adapting as control mechanisms intensified, created an ongoing dialectic that shaped Egyptian slavery's actual practice beyond its theoretical design. The historical record of resistance remains necessarily fragmentary. Successful resistance often went unrecorded precisely because it succeeded in avoiding detection. Egyptian sources, written by and for the slave-owning class, had no interest in documenting slave agency or resistance. What evidence we have comes primarily from archaeological findings, administrative complaints, and punishment records that indirectly reveal resistance through the system's responses to it. The full extent of slave resistance in ancient Egypt almost certainly exceeds what these limited sources reveal. Perhaps most importantly, resistance, even when unsuccessful in achieving freedom or significantly improving conditions, served crucial functions for the enslaved. It preserved human dignity in a system designed to destroy it. It created communities of solidarity despite deliberate atomization. It maintained cultural and personal identity against systematic erasure. It reclaimed tiny fragments of autonomy within nearly total control. Each small act of defiance, each maintained memory, each moment of secret solidarity represented not just opposition to oppression, but affirmation of a humanity that Egyptian slavery sought to eradicate, but never fully could. The struggle between Egyptian systems of control and slave resistance represents more than historical curiosity. It documents the fundamental resilience of human freedom even under history's most sophisticated apparatus of domination. Even when resistance failed to achieve physical liberation, it preserved essential qualities of humanness that the system could never fully extinguish. In that preservation lay the ultimate failure of Egyptian slavery, which could command bodies and break bones, but never completely capture the human spirit that found ways, however small, to remain free. The great monuments of Egypt, the pyramids, temples, and palaces that still draw millions of tourists, represent engineering marvels that have endured millennia. What tourism brochures fail to mention is the human cost embedded in every stone block. These massive structures weren't just architectural achievements, they were monuments to systematic exploitation, each precisely cut stone representing countless broken bodies and extinguished lives. The gleaming limestone that once covered the pyramids was polished with the blood and sweat of generations of slaves. Your day as a construction slave begins before dawn, when the air still holds the desert night's chill. Overseers move through sleeping quarters with whips and shouts, rousing hundreds of workers simultaneously. No gentle awakening, no moment to gather yourself, just the jarring transition from insufficient sleep to immediate labor. You rise from your reed mat, body already aching from yesterday's exertions, joints stiff, muscles protesting. But protest means nothing here. The monument requires progress, and you are merely a component in its creation. The first meal, if it deserves that name, consists of coarse bread and thin beer, primarily water with just enough fermentation to kill dangerous microorganisms. This isn't nourishment designed for human flourishing, but fuel calculated to maintain minimally effective labor. The bread contains enough calories to prevent immediate collapse, but includes stone grit from the grinding process that gradually wears down your teeth. The nutritional science behind these rations isn't compassionate, it's economic, the precise minimum required to keep you functioning without wasting resources. Work assignments come next, distributed by specialized overseers who have memorized the skills and capabilities of every slave under their control. The construction project operates with surprising sophistication, an early version of project management where each task feeds into others in carefully planned sequence. Quarry workers extract stone, transport teams move it to construction sites, masons shape blocks, ramp builders create access to rising levels, support teams provide water, tools, and materials. Each group forms part of a vast human machine designed to transform architectural vision into physical reality. If you're assigned to quarry work, you face perhaps the most immediately dangerous role. Using copper chisels and wooden mallets, You carefully tap along stone faces, following natural fissures to separate building blocks from bedrock. The work requires precision despite exhaustion, as mistakes waste valuable stone and earn savage punishment. Stone dust fills your lungs with each breath, creating a slow-motion suffocation that will eventually kill you if accidents don't claim you first. Quarry collapses represent a constant threat, with poorly supported sections occasionally giving way and crushing workers beneath tons of limestone or granite. Transport teams face different but equally brutal challenges. Moving multi-ton stone blocks from quarries to construction sites involves sophisticated methods that nonetheless rely primarily on raw human muscle. Wooden sledges slide over ground prepared with logs acting as rollers, with teams of slaves pulling in coordinated rhythm. The physics are simple. Sufficient force applied consistently overcomes friction and inertia, but the human cost is staggering. Ropes cut into shoulders and hands. The strain ruptures muscle fibers and damages vertebrae. A moment's loss of coordination can result in crushed limbs or fatal accidents. Construction sites themselves represent hives of specialized activity. Skilled slaves, often prisoners of war with masonry experience, shape stones to precise specifications using copper saws, chisels, and abrasive sand. Others prepare mortar from lime, sand, and water. Ramp builders continuously extend and modify the earthen inclines that allow access to rising levels. Water carriers move constantly through the site, providing the minimum hydration necessary to prevent mass collapse in the desert heat. The entire operation functions with surprising precision, not from compassion, but from cold efficiency in extracting maximum labor from human resources. The technical achievements are undeniable. Without modern equipment, ancient Egyptians achieved astonishing precision. The Great Pyramid's base is level within inches across its entire 13-acre footprint. Stone blocks weighing tons fit together with seams so precise, a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. These engineering marvels, however, reflect not just technical sophistication, but the application of brutal precision to human exploitation. When a worker's life has no value beyond their productive capacity, they become as interchangeable and expendable as the tools they wield. Accidents occur with gruesome regularity. Falling stones crush workers beneath them. Collapsing ramps bury slaves in avalanches of sand and debris. Heat stroke claims lives during summer months when temperatures on stone surfaces can exceed 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The injured receive minimal care, not from compassion, but from the same economic calculation that governs every aspect of slave management. Those with injuries allowing continued work receive basic treatment. Those too damaged for productive labor are discarded, either assigned to menial tasks until they die or simply abandoned. The pace never slackens. Pharaonic construction projects operate under theological as well as practical imperatives. The living God King requires his eternal monument completed before death. Divine timetables allow no consideration for human limitations. During peak construction periods, work continues around the clock, with torches providing illumination for night shifts. The constant cycle prevents proper rest and recovery, accelerating the physical deterioration of the slave workforce. Your body doesn't heal from day to day, it simply accumulates damage until it fails completely. The psychological dimension of monument construction adds another layer of suffering. You labor to create structures of stunning beauty and permanence that celebrate the very system that enslaves you. The theological significance is inescapable. These are not merely buildings, but religious statements about cosmic order, with your degradation and suffering presented as proper, divinely sanctioned elements within that order. Your hands create monuments designed specifically to erase your existence from history while immortalizing those who own you. Work sites develop their own distinctive cultures and languages. Special terms evolve for specific tools, techniques, and problems. Counting cadences and work songs develop to coordinate group efforts. Specialized roles create hierarchies even among slaves. Skilled stonecutters receive marginally better treatment than unskilled haulers. These micro-societies develop under constant pressure, with productivity demands creating tension between solidarity, helping struggling workers, and self-preservation, avoiding association with those falling behind. Monument construction creates distinct archaeological evidence of slave conditions. Worker villages excavated near major pyramid sites reveal living conditions of stunning deprivation. Cramped quarters allow barely enough space to lie down. Minimal sanitation facilities result in endemic disease. Food preparation areas show evidence of the simplest possible meals: grinding stones for grain and basic hearths for cooking porridge or simple bread. The contrast between these squalid conditions and the magnificent monuments rising nearby represents perhaps the starkest physical manifestation of inequality in ancient Egypt. Skeletal remains tell an even more dramatic story. Bones recovered from worker cemeteries show distinctive patterns of damage consistent with extreme physical stress. Vertebrae display compression fractures and premature arthritis. Arm and shoulder bones exhibit abnormal development from repetitive motion. Skulls occasionally show healed fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, likely from accidents or punishment. Most dramatically, these skeletons reveal that many workers were shockingly young, with adolescent remains showing adult patterns of physical damage. Your working life begins early in monument construction and usually ends early as well. The technical aspects of monument construction have received extensive archaeological and engineering analysis, but the human experience behind these achievements remains underexplored. Hieroglyphic accounts celebrate the monuments as triumphs of royal power and divine connection. They describe workers as willing participants in sacred projects. These official narratives deliberately obscure the reality of forced labor, suffering, and death that made such monuments possible. The propaganda begins as soon as the capstone is placed, erasing the human cost from history, even as the bodies of those who paid it lie in unmarked graves nearby. Certain construction roles carried particularly high mortality rates. Copper mining slaves sent to the Sinai Peninsula faced extreme desert conditions, minimal water, and hostile local populations. Transport workers moving granite from Aswan suffered catastrophic injury rates from accidents involving multi-ton stone blocks. Those working with lime for mortar and plaster experienced chemical burns and respiratory damage from caustic dust. These specialized roles became effectively death sentences, with expected survival times measured in months rather than years. Religious aspects of monument construction added ritual dimensions to slave experience. Foundation ceremonies often involved sacrifices, sometimes animal, occasionally human, to consecrate new structures. Completion rituals marked the transformation of construction site to sacred space. Some evidence suggests ceremonial entombment of selected workers within monuments, whether as punishment, sacrifice, or bizarre honor. For slaves, these religious dimensions added another layer of psychological burden. Your suffering and death reframed as necessary components of cosmic order, rather than products of human cruelty. The economic scale of monument construction reshaped entire regions. Supporting thousands of slaves required massive agricultural production, specialized tool manufacturing, and complex supply chains. Satellite industries developed around major projects: rope making, tool production, food processing, and water management. These economic ecosystems functioned to serve construction projects that themselves served no practical purpose. Massive expenditures of resources and human life to create structures with purely symbolic and religious significance. The pyramid projects represent perhaps history's most dramatic example of conspicuous consumption through human exploitation. Time perception takes on unique qualities in monument construction. Unlike agricultural slavery with its seasonal rhythms, construction projects operate on multi-decade timelines. Many slaves live and die seeing only incremental progress on structures designed to last eternity. This temporal disjunction creates a particular psychological burden, your entire life consumed by a project whose completion you'll never witness. The stone you place today may rest 20 levels below the eventual capstone, your contribution buried and forgotten before the structure itself is even finished. Most perversely, monument construction created what archaeologists call site loyalty, a psychological identification with the project despite its role in your exploitation. After years of work on a specific monument, slaves sometimes developed pride in their structure, internalizing the propaganda that framed their forced labor as participation in something greater than themselves. This phenomenon represents perhaps the most successful aspect of Egyptian slave psychology, the colonization of identity so completely that victims identify with the very projects consuming their lives. The bitter irony of Egyptian monument construction lies in its success. These structures have indeed achieved the immortality their builders sought. Tourists still marvel at their scale and precision. Engineering students still study their construction techniques. But this enduring legacy rests on deliberate historical erasure. The official narrative of devoted workers creating monuments for beloved god-kings has largely displaced the reality of brutalized slaves, driven to early graves for the glorification of those who owned them. The monuments themselves represent perhaps history's most successful propaganda, massive physical distortions of historical truth that continue to obscure their own origins, even millennia after their creation. When you next see photographs of the pyramids gleaming against blue Egyptian skies, remember what those precisely cut stones actually represent. Each block bears the invisible weight of countless broken bodies. Each perfect seam was sealed with sweat and blood. The mathematical precision and architectural harmony so admired by modern visitors were achieved through the systematic sacrifice of human lives deemed worthless except as labor units. Egypt's monuments stand not just as engineering marvels, but as enduring testimony to the human capacity for creating beauty through brutality, and then erasing the brutality from the story, leaving only the beauty to echo through history. While slavery crushed all those caught in its grasp, female slaves endured a distinct, often more complex form of bondage. If male slaves were valued primarily for their physical strength, women in bondage faced exploitation that penetrated every dimension of their existence. Not just their labor, but their bodies, their sexuality, their reproductive capacity, and their emotional lives. The archaeological and textual evidence reveals a gendered experience of slavery that added layers of vulnerability to an already brutal institution. As a female slave in ancient Egypt, your body becomes doubly owned. Beyond the standard demands for labor, you face the constant threat of sexual exploitation. Egyptian households operated under absolute patriarchal authority, with male owners having unrestricted access to female slaves. This wasn't considered abuse under Egyptian law or custom, but simply the exercise of property rights. Textual evidence shows female slaves listed in inventories with notations about physical appearance and age that had nothing to do with work capacity and everything to do with sexual availability. Archaeological evidence confirms this sexual dimension of female slavery. Slave quarters in wealthy households often include small chambers adjacent to male sleeping areas, with separate entrances suggesting regular nighttime access. Skeletal remains of female slaves occasionally show pelvic damage consistent with childbirth at extremely young ages, some as young as 12 or 13. Medical papyri include treatments for conditions specific to sexually exploited slaves, including herbs to prevent pregnancy and remedies for injuries resulting from forced intercourse. Pregnancy created particular vulnerability. As a pregnant slave, your value temporarily increases as your body produces new property for your owner. This additional worth rarely translates to better treatment, just closer surveillance to ensure the investment reaches term. Archaeological evidence shows pregnant slaves received marginally better nutrition, not from compassion, but from calculated protection of the developing asset. Egyptian medical texts include specific sections on managing slave pregnancies, with emphasis on maximizing successful births rather than maternal well-being. Childbirth itself occurred without ceremony or specialized care. Unlike free Egyptian women who delivered with midwives and ritual support, slave mothers typically gave birth with minimal assistance. often returning to work within days or even hours. Skeletal evidence shows higher rates of childbirth-related injuries among slave women, including improperly healed pelvic fractures and evidence of traumatic deliveries without medical intervention. Your recovery period would be brutally abbreviated, your physical pain irrelevant compared to the economic value of your immediate return to productive labor. The children born of your body never truly belong to you. Egyptian slavery passed through maternal lines, meaning your status automatically transferred to your offspring regardless of the father's identity. Even children fathered by free Egyptians, including your own master, inherited slave status from their mothers. This ensured the slave population perpetually replenished itself while creating painful psychological dynamics within households where a master's biological children might serve as property alongside their mothers. Raising children under slavery created impossible emotional burdens. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters shows attempts to create nurturing environments despite crushing constraints. Small toys fashioned from discarded materials, makeshift protective amulets, evidence of stories and songs preserved in oral tradition. Yet practical realities made meaningful mothering nearly impossible. Children were separated from mothers during work hours, often supervised collectively by elderly slaves no longer capable of heavier labor. By age 4 or 5, children began their own work assignments, their training in servitude beginning before their physical development could safely accommodate it. For many female slaves, domestic service represented their primary assignment. Household tasks, cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, occupied every waking hour. Unlike field or construction labor with its definite boundaries, domestic work never ended. You remained perpetually on call, your sleep interrupted for any household need, regardless of hour. The proximity to the master's family created psychological complications. You might raise their children from infancy, prepare their most intimate meals, and know their secrets while being reminded constantly of your fundamentally different status. Textile production represented another common assignment for female slaves, particularly those with nimble fingers and good eyesight. Linen production, Egypt's primary fabric, involved grueling multi-step processes, from harvesting flax to spinning, weaving, and finishing. The work environment proved particularly damaging. Excavated textile workshops show poor ventilation combined with high particulate counts from flax processing. Skeletal remains of textile workers display distinctive patterns of repetitive stress injuries to fingers, wrists, and shoulders. Most distinctively, their remains show higher rates of severe myopia and other vision problems resulting from close detail work in poor lighting conditions. Female slaves assigned to food preparation endured their own specialized hardships. Grinding grain, a daily necessity in every Egyptian household, caused distinctive skeletal damage to shoulders, spine, and knees from the repetitive rocking motion required by stone grinding implements. Archaeological evidence shows female slaves who performed this task developed bone spurs and arthritic conditions by their early 20s. The work environment added additional hazards: smoke inhalation from poorly ventilated cooking spaces, burns from open flames, and respiratory damage from flour particles that filled the air during grinding and sifting. Beauty attendants to noble women occupied a particularly complex position in the hierarchy of female slavery. Selected for their appearance and dexterity, these slaves maintained their mistresses' elaborate cosmetic regimens, applying makeup, styling wigs, performing depilation, and administering perfumes. The psychological burden of this role cannot be overstated, spending hours each day enhancing the beauty of the very woman whose husband might sexually exploit you at night. Archaeological evidence from tombs occasionally shows these attendants depicted in wall paintings, always smaller than their mistresses, and in postures of absolute deference despite their intimate physical proximity. Wet nurses occupied another specialized and psychologically complex role. If you produced milk after childbirth, you might be required to nurse the master's infant while your own child received minimal care from others, or, in the cruelest cases, was allowed to starve if resources were deemed inadequate for both. Medical papyri include instructions for maximizing and extending milk production in slave-wet nurses, including forced consumption of specific foods and restriction of activities that might diminish milk supply. The emotional violence of this arrangement, using your body to nourish the oppressor's child while your own receives less, represents one of slavery's most intimate cruelties. Religious institutions employed female slaves in specialized roles that combined domestic service with ritual functions. Temple complexes required constant maintenance, cleaning sacred spaces, preparing ritual meals, maintaining oil lamps, and producing offerings. These positions sometimes offered marginally better conditions than household slavery, but added the burden of ritual purity requirements. Failure to maintain these standards brought particularly severe punishment, as it represented not just disobedience to human masters, but offense against divine order. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes shows separate quarters for female slaves with distinctive architectural features designed to enforce isolation during menstruation or after childbirth, periods considered ritually impure. Markets and commercial enterprises utilized female slaves in various capacities, selling goods, processing materials, serving food and drink. These public-facing roles carried additional vulnerability to harassment and abuse from customers and passers-by. Wall paintings occasionally depict these slaves in commercial settings, always shown smaller than free Egyptians and in postures of civility. Their exposed position in public spaces created constant risk with minimal protection. Unlike household slaves who might develop relationships offering modest protection from the worst abuses, market slaves interacted with strangers whose treatment varied unpredictably. Older female slaves faced particularly harsh transitions. Unlike free Egyptian women, whose status often improved with age through family connections and accumulated wisdom, elderly female slaves simply lost value as their physical capacity diminished. Archaeological evidence shows these women frequently reassigned to grinding grain, the most physically punishing task that required minimal training, until their bodies failed completely. Some received nominal caretaking roles for slave children, but this apparent reduction in physical demands typically came with increased responsibility and blame for any mishap involving their young charges. Resistance took gender-specific forms among female slaves. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals hidden caches of medicinal herbs known to prevent conception, a form of reproductive resistance concealed from masters. Some evidence suggests covert communication networks among female slaves that shared information about which herbs induced abortion, which masters were particularly brutal, and which overseers might be manipulated through various strategies. These resistance networks operated through whispered exchanges during water collection, laundry tasks, or other occasions when female slaves might briefly interact away from direct supervision. Female solidarity represented a crucial survival mechanism. Excavations of slave quarters sometimes reveal evidence of cooperative childcare arrangements, shared toys, communal sleeping areas for children, and food preparation spaces designed for collective meal production rather than individual portions. These arrangements suggest systems where women worked together to ensure children received care when mothers were assigned elsewhere. This mutual support directly countered the isolation and atomization that slave systems deliberately fostered. The multidimensional exploitation of female slaves as workers, sexual objects, reproductive vessels, and emotional caretakers created particularly complex psychological burdens. Required to nurture the children of your oppressors, while denied full motherhood of your own offspring. Forced to enhance the beauty of women who enjoyed the social status permanently denied to you. Expected to provide emotional comfort and intimate care to the very household whose patriarch might sexually exploit you at will. These contradictory demands created impossible psychological binds from which there was no escape except through subtle forms of internal resistance that left few archaeological traces. Perhaps most painfully, female slaves experienced a fundamental disconnection from Egyptian ideals of womanhood. Free Egyptian women, while subordinate to men in many respects, nonetheless enjoyed religious recognition, legal rights to own property, and cultural celebration of their maternal roles. Female slaves existed outside this framework entirely, denied the dignity, protection, and cultural validation afforded even to lower-class free women. Wall paintings and hieroglyphic texts almost never acknowledge female slaves as women at all, depicting them instead as generic labor units, distinguished only by the tasks they perform rather than by gender identity. The archaeological record reveals these women primarily through their absence. The nameless, faceless thousands whose bodies and lives built Egyptian civilization through invisible daily labor. Textile remnants, food preparation areas, household maintenance tools, and child-rearing spaces all testify to their existence, yet almost never do they appear as recognized individuals in Egyptian records. This systematic erasure represents perhaps the most complete success of the Egyptian slave system, the rendering invisible of those whose constant labor maintained every aspect of daily life. When female slaves do appear in official Egyptian art, they're depicted through crude stereotypes. Foreign women with exaggerated features shown in postures of absolute submission. These images served clear propaganda purposes, reinforcing the supposed natural order that placed Egyptian men at the pinnacle and foreign slave women at the absolute bottom. The gap between these demeaning representations and the complex reality of female slaves' lives, their strategies for survival, their maintenance of dignity despite everything designed to strip it away, their preservation of cultural knowledge against systematic erasure, represents one of ancient history's most profound distortions. For female slaves in ancient Egypt, existence meant navigating multiple layers of oppression simultaneously, as slaves, as women, often as foreigners, and always as the most vulnerable members of a brutally hierarchical society. That many, nonetheless, found ways to resist, to nurture, to preserve cultural knowledge, and to maintain human connection, despite everything arrayed against them, testifies not to the system's occasional mercies, but to the extraordinary resilience of women who, though written out of history, formed its essential foundation. While all slaves in ancient Egypt suffered under the weight of bondage, the experience varied dramatically, depending on your origin. The Egyptian slave system operated with sophisticated ethnic hierarchies that created distinct tiers of exploitation, with foreign-born slaves typically occupying the lowest and most brutal levels. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals a carefully stratified system that weaponized cultural differences to enhance control, while systematically erasing the identities of those deemed most alien to Egyptian sensibilities. If you entered slavery as a foreigner, perhaps captured in one of Egypt's military campaigns in Nubia, Libya, or Canaan, your introduction to bondage began with profound disorientation. Unlike Egyptian-born slaves, who at least understood the language and customs of their oppressors, you faced a comprehensive cultural shock alongside the physical trauma of enslavement. Egyptian records describe the deliberate separation of captives who shared the same language or homeland, a strategic practice designed to prevent communication and solidarity. Wall paintings show foreign captives bound in distinctive ways, often with papyrus reed restraints tied in symbolic knots, representing Egypt's dominion over foreign lands. Language barriers created perhaps the most immediate and isolating dimension of foreign slave experience. Unable to understand commands, unfamiliar with Egyptian social codes, you faced punishment for failures of comprehension rather than willful disobedience. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters occasionally reveals small hidden objects inscribed with non-Egyptian scripts, desperate attempts to preserve written language despite prohibitions. Some slave owners deliberately prevented foreign slaves from learning Egyptian beyond the minimum vocabulary needed for basic tasks, ensuring they remained linguistically isolated and dependent on interpreters who were themselves, often slaves, slightly higher in the hierarchy. Your physical appearance marked you instantly as other in Egyptian society. Wall paintings and reliefs consistently depict foreign slaves with exaggerated ethnic features, distinctive non-Egyptian hairstyles, and identifying markers of homeland origin. Archaeological evidence shows that some slave owners physically modified foreign slaves to enhance these visible differences. Distinctive scarification patterns, tattoos, or brandings that permanently marked not just slave status, but specific ethnic identity. These visible markers served dual purposes, facilitating immediate identification of runaways and reinforcing ideological narratives about the supposed natural inferiority of non-Egyptian peoples. Religious differences added another dimension to the foreign slave experience. Egypt's complex theological system, with its elaborate rituals and numerous deities, represented a stark contrast to the religious practices of many neighboring cultures. As a foreign slave, your native religious practices were typically forbidden or impossible to maintain due to lack of access to necessary materials or sacred spaces. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals hidden shrines or small amulets of non-Egyptian deities, suggesting desperate attempts to maintain spiritual connections despite overwhelming pressure to abandon them. Some Egyptian religious texts explicitly frame foreign slaves as spiritually polluted, requiring ritual purification before certain tasks or placements. Within the already brutal hierarchy of slavery, archaeological and textual evidence reveals a clear ethnic stratification system. Nubian slaves, due to proximity and long-standing conflict between Egypt and Nubia, often receive particularly harsh treatment. Wall paintings frequently depict Nubians assigned to the most physically demanding and dangerous tasks, mining, quarrying, or construction in the most extreme conditions. Skeletal remains from sites identified as Nubian slave quarters show higher rates of traumatic injury and evidence of more severe physical punishment compared to other slave populations. Asiatic slaves from Canaan and Syria occupied a slightly different position. Egyptian texts suggest they were often valued for specific craft skills, metalworking, specialized weaving techniques, or architectural knowledge. This perceived value occasionally translated to marginally better treatment, though still within the fundamental brutality of the slave system. Archaeological evidence shows some Asiatic slaves maintained distinctive dietary practices despite enslavement, with food preparation areas showing evidence of cooking techniques not typical of Egyptian cuisine. Libyan slaves, often captured in Egypt's Western Desert campaigns, appear in records primarily assigned to agricultural work or animal husbandry. Their familiarity with desert-edge farming techniques sometimes created specialized roles managing livestock in marginal areas. Skeletal evidence suggests these slaves experienced high rates of sun exposure and repetitive stress injuries consistent with animal management and agricultural labor. Beyond these major groups, Egyptian military expansion occasionally brought in slaves from more distant regions, people from the Mediterranean islands, the deeper reaches of Africa, or even occasionally from Far Eastern territories reached through trade networks. These especially exotic slaves often occupied display roles in wealthy households, their distinctive appearance treated as status symbols by Egyptian elites. Wall paintings sometimes show these individuals in courtyard scenes or ceremonial settings, their foreign features and coloring emphasized to showcase the owner's far-reaching connections and power. The treatment of children born to foreign slaves reveals particularly cruel dimensions of the Egyptian system. Archaeological evidence shows these children were deliberately separated from parents at young ages and raised in Egyptian-speaking environments, a systematic attempt to erase cultural transmission between generations. Unlike children of Egyptian-born slaves, who might at least understand the cultural context of their bondage, these children occupied a painful, liminal space, visibly marked as foreign by their physical features, but disconnected from their ancestral cultures, languages, and identities. The journey into Egyptian slavery created distinctive trauma for foreign-born slaves. Records and artistic depictions describe the forced marches of captured peoples, often covering hundreds of miles in chains under brutal conditions. Egyptian military texts sometimes specify the exact numbers of captives at departure and arrival, with differences starkly quantifying those who died en route. Unlike Egyptian-born slaves, who at least remained in familiar geographic surroundings, Foreign slaves experienced the additional disorientation of forced relocation across vast distances, often through challenging terrain, deliberately chosen to maximize suffering and minimize escape opportunities. Cultural disorientation extended to basic daily practices. Food preparation methods, hygiene customs, sleeping arrangements, and social interactions all followed Egyptian patterns that might directly contradict the practices of your homeland. Archaeological evidence shows some attempts to maintain cultural practices. Distinctive hair braiding patterns preserved despite prohibition, cooking techniques adapted to available materials, or specific bodily adornments maintained when possible. These small preservations of identity represented significant resistance within a system designed to erase foreign cultural distinctiveness completely. Egyptian-born slaves, while suffering under the same fundamental oppression, experienced somewhat different conditions. Most entered slavery through debt bondage, criminal punishment, or inherited status rather than capture. This created a different psychological relationship to bondage, still traumatic, but lacking the additional layers of cultural displacement experienced by foreign slaves. Egyptian-born slaves at least understood the social contexts, religious references, and linguistic nuances of their environment, providing some minimal navigational advantages within the system. The primary advantage for Egyptian-born slaves came through potential social connections. Unlike foreigners completely severed from kinship networks, some Egyptian slaves maintained tenuous relationships with free relatives or former community members. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals gifts or support items in slave quarters that couldn't have been acquired through normal slave channels, suggesting external assistance from free Egyptians with connections to enslaved individuals. These relationships sometimes created minimal protection or advocacy, particularly in cases of extreme abuse or exploitation beyond even the brutal Egyptian norm. Language fluency provided another significant advantage for Egyptian-born slaves. Understanding not just commands, but nuance, context, and implications allowed these slaves to better anticipate owner expectations and avoid punishment for misunderstanding. Textual evidence suggests Egyptian-born slaves were more likely to receive specialized training or skilled positions precisely because communication barriers didn't complicate their instruction. This language advantage occasionally created intermediary roles for Egyptian slaves, who might serve as interpreters or supervisors for foreign slaves, creating complex power dynamics within slave communities. The religious dimension differed significantly as well. Egyptian-born slaves, while excluded from full religious participation, nonetheless understood the theological frameworks, ritual calendars, and divine hierarchies that structured Egyptian spiritual life. This understanding provided context for religious obligations and prohibitions that remained mysterious and arbitrary to foreign slaves. Archaeological evidence shows Egyptian-born slaves occasionally received minimal funeral rituals upon death, while foreign slaves more frequently appear in mass graves with no evidence of ceremonial treatment, a distinction that reflected perceived differences in spiritual status. Documentary evidence reveals Egyptian-born slaves occasionally achieved manumission, freedom, particularly those who entered slavery through debt bondage rather than inherited status. These pathways to potential freedom remained largely closed to foreign slaves, who were viewed as permanently alien and unsuitable for integration into Egyptian society. The psychological impact of this differential access to even the remote possibility of freedom created another dimension of stratification within slave communities. The fundamental brutality of the Egyptian slave system should not be minimized, even when acknowledging these differences. All slaves, regardless of origin, experienced physical abuse, psychological torture, malnutrition, and premature death. The distinctions between Egyptian and foreign slaves represented differences in degree rather than kind, variations within a system fundamentally designed to extract maximum labor while crushing human dignity and autonomy. What archaeological and textual evidence consistently reveals is the sophisticated way Egyptian authorities weaponized these differences to enhance control. By creating hierarchies within slave populations, by distributing marginally better conditions based on ethnic origin, and by establishing intermediate power positions for some slaves over others. The system deliberately prevented unified resistance. Foreign slaves, facing the worst conditions, remained isolated by language and culture from potential allies. Egyptian slaves, with slightly better positions, became invested in maintaining those small advantages, rather than risking them through solidarity with those below. Perhaps the most tragic dimension of this stratified system appears in burial contexts. Archaeological excavations of slave cemeteries reveal distinctive grouping patterns. Egyptian-born slaves buried separately from foreigners, different foreign groups separated from each other. Even in death, the divisions carefully cultivated during life remained enforced. The Egyptian slave system understood that human connection represents a fundamental threat to oppressive control, and it systematically prevented such connection across ethnic lines from the moment of capture until the moment of death. The experience of slavery in ancient Egypt thus varied significantly depending on whether you entered the system as a foreigner or as an Egyptian. Yet focusing exclusively on these differences risks missing the larger truth that the entire system represented a deliberate, sophisticated apparatus for extracting human labor while denying human dignity. The ethnic hierarchies, the differential treatment, and the strategic exploitation of cultural differences all served the same fundamental purpose: to prevent those at the bottom of Egyptian society from recognizing their shared humanity and common interest in resistance against a system designed to consume their lives for the benefit of those who claimed to own them. In a civilization where religion permeated every aspect of existence, the spiritual dimensions of slavery created particularly painful contradictions. Ancient Egypt's elaborate theological systems, with their promise of eternal life and cosmic justice, offered radically different spiritual experiences depending on your status. For slaves, religious life involved navigating complex terrain, forbidden from full participation in Egyptian practices, yet often separated from their native spiritual traditions, caught between theological systems that simultaneously justified their bondage and offered rare glimpses of transcendence beyond physical suffering. The fundamental cruelty began with Egypt's core religious concept, Ma'at, the divine order that structured the universe. Egyptian theology presented social hierarchy not as human arrangement, but cosmic necessity. Pharaoh ruled as divine incarnation. Nobles served as his divine delegates. Commoners supported this structure through labor and tribute. And slaves, theological texts explicitly position them outside the spiritual community entirely, necessary tools for maintaining divine order, but not participants within it. Wall paintings in temples frequently depict slaves as faceless figures bearing the weight of the world, literally supporting higher social orders, who alone maintain direct connection with the gods. Your access to Egyptian religious practices varied dramatically depending on your owner and role. Household slaves witnessed religious rituals performed by the family, but remained observers rather than participants. Construction slaves built temples they could never enter for worship. Agricultural slaves grew offerings they could never present. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals small, crude shrines in slave quarters, attempts to create sacred space within environments deliberately designed to deny spiritual dignity. These improvised worship areas typically show syncretistic elements, blending Egyptian deities with gods from slaves' homelands in desperate attempts to access divine protection from whatever source might respond. The Egyptian afterlife presented particularly painful contradictions for enslaved people. Egyptian religion promised elaborate continuation of existence after death, but only for those with proper mummification, tombs, offerings, and magical texts to navigate the dangerous journey to the field of reeds. Slaves received none of these preparations. Archaeological excavations of slave cemeteries reveal minimal burial treatment. Bodies placed in shallow pits without preservation, without grave goods, without inscriptions or spells to ensure safe passage. The ultimate spiritual promise of Egyptian religion, eternal life, remained explicitly denied to those whose labor built the very tombs and temples, making that promise possible for others. This theological exclusion created profound existential questions. What happened to a slave's ka, life force, and bay, personality, after death without proper funerary treatment? Some evidence suggests slaves developed alternative afterlife beliefs, syncretistic visions combining elements of Egyptian concepts with homeland traditions to create possible pathways to posthumous dignity denied in life. Small amulets, occasionally found in slave burials, hint at these private spiritual adaptations. Crude scarabs, hastily formed ushabti figures, or symbols associated with foreign deities of death and rebirth. Religious calendar observances created another dimension of spiritual disjunction. Egyptian life revolved around elaborate festival schedules honoring various deities with processions, feasts, and ritual observances. As a slave, you experienced these festivals primarily through increased workload, preparing food and settings for celebrations you couldn't join, cleaning up afterward, maintaining spaces you couldn't enter as a worshipper. Some textual evidence suggests slaves received minimal time allowances during major festivals like the Opet Festival or Beautiful Feast of the Valley, but these represented brief pauses in labor rather than meaningful spiritual participation. The relationship between slaves and Egypt's pantheon of deities reflected these contradictions. Archaeological evidence shows particular devotion among slaves to specific gods associated with protection and mercy. Bes, the household protector; Taweret, guardian of childbirth; and most significantly Ptah, patron of craftsmen, who was believed to hear prayers regardless of social status. Small amulets depicting these deities appear with greater frequency in slave contexts than representations of more aristocratic gods like Amun-Ra or Horus, suggesting strategic spiritual alignment with divine forces perceived as potentially responsive to those at the bottom of society. For foreign-born slaves, religious displacement added another layer of spiritual trauma. Separated from sacred landscapes, ritual objects, and community practices of their homeland traditions, these slaves faced comprehensive theological disruption alongside physical bondage. Some archaeological evidence suggests desperate attempts to maintain homeland worship. Small figurines of foreign deities hidden in slave quarters, distinctive burial positions reflecting non-Egyptian spiritual concepts, or adaptation of Egyptian materials to approximate homeland ritual objects. These spiritual preservations represented significant resistance against a system designed to erase not just physical freedom, but cosmic identity. Temple slaves occupied a particularly complex religious position. Owned directly by religious institutions rather than individuals, these slaves maintained sacred spaces, prepared ritual offerings, and supported priestly functions while remaining fundamentally excluded from the spiritual benefits their labor facilitated. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes shows separate quarters for these slaves, often with distinctive architectural features enforcing ritual separation, specialized washing areas, isolation chambers for periods of impurity, and physical barriers preventing access to sacred inner spaces they maintained but could not enter for worship. The question of what slaves believed amid these contradictions remains challenging for historians and archaeologists. Written records almost never preserve slave perspectives directly. What evidence we have comes primarily from material culture, burial practices, hidden religious objects, adapted ritual spaces, and physical modifications to standard Egyptian religious items. This fragmentary record suggests extraordinary spiritual resilience, the maintenance of some form of cosmic meaning and divine connection despite systematic theological exclusion. Some Egyptian religious texts hint at alternative spiritual understandings among slaves through cautionary warnings. Magical papyri occasionally include spells specifically designed to prevent slave uprisings, with references to foreign gods who whisper rebellion, or servants who seek power through hidden rituals. These texts indirectly acknowledge the existence of alternative religious practices among slave populations that Egyptian authorities perceived as potentially threatening to the established order. The very existence of such countermeasures suggests slave spirituality represented a domain authorities could never fully control, despite comprehensive physical dominance. Death rites reveal the starkest spiritual inequalities. While Egyptian elites invested enormous resources in elaborate tombs, mummification, and magical texts to ensure comfortable afterlife transition, slave burials show minimal investment or ceremony. Archaeological excavations of slave cemeteries reveal mass graves with bodies positioned haphazardly, without preservation treatments, grave goods, or identifying markers. Unlike even poor free Egyptians who received basic funerary preparations, slaves often appear to have been disposed of with minimal recognition of their humanity, let alone their spiritual existence. Perhaps the cruelest irony lay in the construction of tombs and temples. As a construction slave, you might spend decades building elaborate monuments, ensuring someone else's eternal spiritual comfort and commemoration, while knowing your own body would eventually be discarded without ceremony. The hands that carved religious texts promising divine justice and cosmic balance would themselves be denied the very comfort and security those texts described. Your labor created eternal spiritual homes for others, while your own spiritual fate remained uncertain and unaddressed. In this theological vacuum, evidence suggests slaves developed their own religious understandings that Egyptian records never captured. Small archaeological clues hint at these belief systems, distinctive patterns of broken pottery in burial contexts, suggesting ritual libations performed secretly. Unusual positioning of bodies, contrary to Egyptian practices. Hidden caches of objects with apparent spiritual significance, but no clear Egyptian religious function. These fragments suggest communities maintaining spiritual practices outside Egyptian theological frameworks, preserving alternative understandings of divine forces and afterlife possibilities. Some evidence suggests particular spiritual focus on transitional or liminal deities, gods associated with boundaries, thresholds, or mediation between realms. Amulets and small figurines of Egyptian gods like Wep-Wawet, the opener of ways, appear with notable frequency in slave contexts, suggesting strategic spiritual alignment with divine forces that might facilitate crossing boundaries, perhaps between life and death, bondage and freedom, or separation and reunion with homeland. This theological adaptation represents sophisticated spiritual resistance, identifying potential divine allies within the oppressor's pantheon. Religious calendar observations offered rare opportunities for relative autonomy. Evidence suggests some slave owners permitted limited observance of homeland religious dates, not from respect, but from pragmatic recognition that allowing minimal spiritual expression reduced resistance and improved productivity. These calendar observations often became focal points for cultural preservation and community formation, with religious ceremonies serving as covers for maintaining ethnic identity, language, and social bonds that authorities might otherwise prohibit as potentially dangerous. For some slaves, particularly those from Nubia or Canaan, evidence suggests maintenance of ancestor veneration practices despite separation from homeland burial grounds. Archaeological findings occasionally include small shrine-like arrangements in slave quarters with objects apparently representing deceased family members, crude figurines, distinctive stones, or preserved personal items. These improvised ancestor connections maintained spiritual continuity despite geographic displacement, creating sacred lineage that contradicted the Egyptian system's attempt to erase slave history and identity. The question of whether slaves believed they would continue serving in the afterlife adds another dimension to their spiritual experience. Egyptian religious texts sometimes reference servants continuing their roles in the field of reeds, suggesting the theological position that social hierarchy extended beyond death. Whether slaves internalized this perspective or maintained alternative afterlife visions remains difficult to determine from available evidence. Some burial contexts suggest resistance to this concept through deliberate positioning contrary to Egyptian practices, perhaps asserting different posthumous destinies than eternal servitude. What emerges from this fragmentary evidence is a picture of extraordinary spiritual resilience. Despite systematic theological exclusion, despite denial of proper funerary treatment, despite separation from homeland traditions, slaves in ancient Egypt appears to have maintained some form of spiritual life that provided meaning, community, and occasional transcendence beyond their physical bondage. These religious adaptations and preservations represented significant resistance against a system designed to control not just bodies but souls, to deny slaves access to cosmic meaning and divine connection that might contradict their designated role as mere tools within the Egyptian order. The spiritual dimension of Egyptian slavery thus represents both the system's cruelest aspect and its most significant failure. A theological framework that justified bondage, that denied spiritual equality, and that excluded slaves from promises of eternal comfort, nonetheless could not prevent those it oppressed from finding alternative pathways to divine connection and cosmic meaning. In the hidden shrines, adapted rituals, and secret observances that archaeological evidence occasionally reveals, we glimpse perhaps the most profound dimension of slave resistance, the preservation of spiritual humanity, despite everything designed to deny it. The echoes of Egyptian slavery resonate far beyond the ancient Nile Valley. This sophisticated system of human exploitation didn't simply vanish with the pharaohs. It cast long shadows across history, influencing subsequent slave systems, shaping cultural narratives, and leaving complex archaeological and ethical questions that continue to challenge our understanding of civilization itself. The legacy of Egyptian slavery lives on, not just in monuments and artifacts, but in institutional memories, historical distortions, and the ongoing struggle to reconcile magnificent cultural achievements with the brutal exploitation that made them possible. Egyptian slavery provided a template that subsequent civilizations adapted and refined. The Romans, notorious for their extensive use of slave labor, borrowed specific control mechanisms first developed in Egypt, particularly the sophisticated division of slave populations by origin and the strategic creation of hierarchies within slave communities to prevent unified resistance. Archaeological evidence shows striking similarities between Egyptian and Roman slave quarter designs, surveillance systems, and punishment methodologies. This institutional memory transmitted Egyptian innovations in human exploitation across centuries and civilizations. The economic impact of Egyptian slavery created models of resource extraction that influenced subsequent systems. Egypt demonstrated how concentrated unfree labor could transform landscapes, redirect rivers, build monumental architecture, and generate agricultural surpluses far beyond what free labor markets could accomplish. This economic lesson wasn't lost on later empires. The massive wealth disparities made possible through systematic exploitation became a blueprint for imperial economies from Rome to the colonial powers of the modern era. Egyptian slavery proved that human bondage, properly managed, could generate extraordinary wealth for a small elite, a destructive lesson that humanity has repeatedly reapplied. Perhaps the most significant legacy lies in the realm of historical narrative, specifically the systematic erasure of slave experiences from official accounts. Egyptian monuments, texts, and artistic works almost never acknowledge the forced labor that created them. This deliberate omission established a pattern of historical distortion that continues to influence how we understand ancient civilizations. The Egyptian model of celebrating architectural and cultural achievements while rendering invisible the exploitation that enabled them has been repeated throughout history, creating persistent blind spots in our understanding of how civilizations actually functioned. Modern archaeology has begun challenging these historical distortions. Excavations at sites like Giza, Deir el-Medina, and Tel el-Dabba have revealed the physical reality of slave existence through skeletal remains, living quarters, work sites, and burial grounds. These findings contradict traditional narratives about willing workers or honored laborers participating in monumental projects. The physical evidence, stress markers on bones, trauma patterns consistent with punishment, mass graves without proper burial treatments, tells a different story than the one inscribed on temple walls. This archaeological correction represents an ongoing process of recovering voices systematically silenced by official Egyptian accounts. The biblical narrative of Hebrew enslavement in Egypt represents another complex dimension of Egyptian slavery's legacy. The Exodus account, describing the bondage of Israelites and their eventual liberation, has profoundly influenced Jewish identity and subsequently Christian and Islamic understanding of freedom and divine justice. Archaeological evidence regarding the historical accuracy of this specific narrative remains contested. Some scholars point to the Hyksos period, approximately 1650–1550 BCE, as a possible historical context, while others question whether the events occurred as described. Regardless of historical specifics, the narrative's enduring power demonstrates how Egyptian slavery became a foundational metaphor for oppression and liberation in Western religious thought. The contrast between Egypt's cultural achievements and the exploitation that enabled them creates ongoing ethical tensions in how we approach this civilization. Museums worldwide display magnificent Egyptian artifacts without adequately addressing the unfree labor that created them. Tourism marketing highlights the engineering precision of the pyramids while downplaying the human costs of their construction. Educational materials often present sanitized versions of Egyptian civilization that minimize or completely ignore the centrality of slavery to its functioning. This pattern of separation, admiring the achievements while ignoring their human cost, represents perhaps the most persistent legacy of Egyptian slavery in our contemporary engagement with the ancient world. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed disturbing details about the physical reality of Egyptian slavery that historical texts deliberately obscured. DNA analysis of remains from slave cemeteries has confirmed the diverse geographic origins of enslaved populations, supporting textual accounts of capture through military campaigns across northeastern Africa and the Near East. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones has documented the forced migration patterns of slaves brought to Egypt from distant regions. These scientific techniques provide physical confirmation of the massive scale of human trafficking that underpinned Egyptian civilization, challenging romanticized views of its cultural achievements. The legacy of Egyptian slavery also appears in the physical landscape itself. Massive hydrological engineering projects using slave labor permanently altered the Nile Valley's ecology. Stone quarries where generations of slaves labored remain visible scars on the landscape. The very geography of modern Egypt bears the imprint of ancient exploitation. The placement of settlements, agricultural patterns, and transportation routes all reflect design choices made possible only through the application of unfree labor on an enormous scale. This physical transformation represents one of Egyptian slavery's most enduring and concrete legacies. Perhaps most disturbing is how Egyptian justifications for slavery established ideological precedents that subsequent slave systems adopted and refined. The Egyptian concept that certain populations were naturally suited for enslavement because of ethnic origin, perceived cultural inferiority, or divine order provided a template for later ideological defenses of human bondage. The sophisticated theological justifications developed by Egyptian priests, presenting social hierarchy as cosmic necessity rather than human arrangement, reappear with striking similarity in later religious defenses of slavery from ancient Greece to the antebellum American South. The whitewashing of Egyptian slavery in popular culture represents another problematic legacy. Hollywood films consistently depict ancient Egypt as a land of mystery and wonder, while minimizing or completely ignoring the central role of slavery in its functioning. Museum exhibitions focus on artistic achievements and technological innovations without adequate context about the exploitation that enabled them. Even academic treatments sometimes use euphemisms like corvée labor or conscripted workers rather than directly addressing the reality of chattel slavery. This pattern of sanitization prevents full reckoning with the moral complexity of Egyptian civilization. For descendants of populations targeted by Egyptian slave raids, particularly Nubians, Libyans, and Canaanites, the legacy includes inherited cultural trauma and disrupted historical continuity. Archaeological evidence documents the devastating impact of Egyptian slave acquisition campaigns on these societies: destroyed settlements, population collapses, and cultural discontinuities that appear in the archaeological record as abrupt changes in material culture. These impacts didn't end with antiquity, but created long-term developmental trajectories for regions repeatedly targeted by Egyptian slave raiders over centuries. The technological innovations developed specifically for slave management represent another disturbing legacy. Egyptian innovations in restraint devices, surveillance systems, and control mechanisms established engineering traditions specifically focused on human subjugation. Archaeological evidence shows these technologies weren't incidental, but represented significant investment of design resources and material refinement. The deliberate application of engineering skill toward more effective human exploitation established technological lineages that continued long after Egyptian civilization faded. The economic legacy extends beyond models of wealth generation to include specific practices that later slave systems adopted. Egyptian innovation in slave insurance and replacement strategies, calculating expected working lifespans, optimal exploitation rates, and systematic replacement through reproduction or capture, created actuarial approaches to human bondage that reappear with disturbing similarity in later slave economies. These sophisticated economic calculations, treating humans as depreciating assets, represent an institutional memory transmitted across centuries through administrative practices and record-keeping traditions. For contemporary Egyptians, this legacy creates complex questions of historical identity and ethical responsibility. Modern Egypt celebrates its pharaonic heritage as source of national pride and tourism revenue, while often maintaining significant distance from the slavery that underpinned that heritage. This separation, claiming the cultural achievements while minimizing the exploitation that enabled them, represents an ongoing negotiation with a morally complex past that many societies with histories of slavery continue to navigate in different ways. Perhaps the most important legacy of Egyptian slavery lies in what it reveals about the relationship between civilization and exploitation. The magnificent achievements we associate with ancient Egypt, monumental architecture, sophisticated art, advanced mathematics, influential religious concepts, were made possible through systematic human bondage on a massive scale. This uncomfortable truth challenges simplistic narratives about the development of civilization and forces consideration of the human costs embedded in achievements we continue to admire and study. Archaeological evidence continues revealing new dimensions of Egyptian slavery, suggesting its legacy remains incompletely understood. Recent excavations have identified previously unknown slave quarters, burial sites, and work areas that expand our understanding of slavery's scale and centrality to Egyptian functioning. These ongoing discoveries suggest Egyptian slavery was even more extensive than previously recognized, with unfree labor representing not an incidental feature, but the fundamental engine of Egyptian achievement across 3,000 years of history. The silent testimony of slave remains, excavated from unmarked graves, bearing physical evidence of exploitation, punishment, and premature death, represents perhaps the most powerful legacy of Egyptian slavery. These anonymous bones speak what hieroglyphic texts deliberately omit. They testify to lives consumed by a system designed to extract maximum labor while denying basic humanity. They challenge the sanitized narratives inscribed on temple walls and force recognition of the actual human cost behind monumental achievements. As archaeological techniques continue advancing, these silent witnesses increasingly find voice, gradually restoring to historical visibility those whom Egyptian authorities deliberately erased. This legacy of Egyptian slavery isn't merely historical curiosity, but offers crucial perspective on contemporary questions about how we understand civilization. acknowledge exploitation, and reckon with morally complex heritage. The magnificent monuments along the Nile don't simply represent engineering achievements or artistic triumphs. They embody a fundamental ethical question about what civilization means when built upon systematic human suffering. As we continue excavating the physical evidence of Egyptian slavery, we simultaneously unearth challenging questions about how societies create achievement, distribute suffering, and construct historical narratives that often hide as much as they reveal about the actual human experience of the past. When we gaze upon the magnificent monuments of ancient Egypt, the soaring pyramids, the elegant temples, the sprawling palaces, we're looking at more than architectural achievements. We're witnessing the physical embodiment of countless unnamed lives consumed by a system of exploitation so thorough it transformed human beings into expendable tools. The gleaming limestone, the precisely cut granite, the elegant hieroglyphs, all were purchased with broken bodies and crushed spirits that history has largely chosen to forget. The nameless millions who built Egyptian civilization left few direct testimonies. They weren't permitted to carve their stories into temple walls or paint their experiences in tomb chambers. Their perspective appears nowhere in the official record deliberately crafted to glorify the very system that consumed them. Yet their existence speaks through other channels, through skeletal remains bearing markers of brutal labor, through hastily dug mass graves, through the crude possessions buried with them or hidden in slave quarters. These silent witnesses testify to lives spent building immortality for others, while being denied the most basic dignity themselves. The contrast between Egypt's cultural splendor and the brutality that enabled it creates a profound moral paradox that extends far beyond academic interest. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about civilization itself. What does it mean when magnificent achievements rest on foundations of systematic suffering? How do we reconcile our admiration for ancient Egyptian art, architecture, and religious concepts with the exploitation that made them possible? These questions don't belong solely to history. They challenge us to examine what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore when engaging with complex cultural legacies. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Egyptian slavery was not its physical brutality, though that was extreme, but its comprehensive nature. The system didn't just claim bodies, it methodically attacked personhood itself. Through deliberate strategies of isolation, cultural erasure, linguistic control, and psychological manipulation, Egyptian slavery sought to transform humans into objects, thinking tools that retained just enough agency to perform required labor, while surrendering any sense of independent identity or dignity. This assault on the fundamental essence of humanity represents slavery's deepest violence. Yet amid this comprehensive oppression, archaeological evidence reveals extraordinary resilience. Hidden amulets of forbidden deities, secret maintenance of homeland languages, adapted cultural practices preserved despite prohibition, improvised communities forged through whispered exchanges and shared suffering. These fragments suggest that even within history's most sophisticated system of bondage, the human spirit found ways to preserve dignity, connection, and meaning against overwhelming pressure to surrender them. This resistance represents not just historical curiosity, but testimony to something unconquerable in human nature. The Egyptian slave system operated with chilling efficiency precisely because it understood human psychology with remarkable sophistication. Its control mechanisms, physical, psychological, cultural, and religious, worked in coordinated fashion to maximize exploitation while minimizing resistance. The system recognized that the most effective bondage enslaves the mind as thoroughly as the body. It understood how to weaponize hope, how to create dependency through calculated mercies, how to prevent solidarity through strategic divisions. This psychological insight makes Egyptian slavery particularly disturbing to contemplate, a system that used profound understanding of humanity to more effectively deny human dignity. For those who actually experienced this bondage, slavery wasn't a historical category or sociological phenomenon. but lived reality, day after grinding day of pain, humiliation, and erasure, with no realistic hope of escape or improvement. The Egyptian slave didn't experience their condition as an abstract concept, but as thirst unquenched, hunger partially satisfied, bodies breaking under impossible demands, families separated by owner whim, identities systematically dismantled, and futures foreclosed before they could be imagined. This experiential dimension, the actual lived reality of bondage, remains perhaps the most difficult aspect to recover from the historical record. As we conclude this journey through one of history's darkest institutions, we should recognize that understanding Egyptian slavery isn't merely academic exercise. It provides crucial context for the monuments and artifacts we continue to admire. It challenges simplistic narratives about the development of civilization. It reminds us that history written by the powerful systematically erases the experiences of those they exploit. Most importantly, it restores some measure of visibility to the countless unnamed individuals who built Egypt's eternal monuments while being denied the most basic recognition of their own humanity. The next time you see an image of the Great Pyramid gleaming against the desert sky, remember the hands that placed each massive stone, hands attached to human beings with hopes, fears, pain, and dreams that the official historical record deliberately chose to ignore. Remember the bodies broken to create that geometric perfection. Remember the lives consumed to build eternity for others. In that remembering lies a small act of justice, an acknowledgement that Egyptian civilization's magnificent achievements and brutal exploitation cannot be separated, but must be understood as inextricably connected dimensions of the same complex legacy. Egyptian slavery reminds us that civilization's most celebrated achievements often rest on foundations of profound suffering, a truth as relevant to contemporary society as to ancient history. The hands that built wonder deserve to be remembered alongside the wonder itself. Their story, though deliberately erased from official records, emerges through archaeology, anthropology, and our willingness to look unflinchingly at both the light and shadow of human achievement. In that complete vision, acknowledging both the brilliance and the brutality of the past, lies our best hope for creating a more just future.